Hello, friends. If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments.
The session with patient 42 was scheduled for 2 p.m. sharp, the same time slot he'd occupied for the past 6 months. I prided myself on punctuality, a necessity when treating patients with obsessive-compulsive tendencies. Marcus Wellington had been referred for his compulsive need to arrange objects in perfect symmetry, a behavior that had cost him his job as an architectural draftsman and eventually his marriage. My office embodied the kind of controlled environment Marcus found comforting. Books arranged by height on the shelves, diplomas hung at precise intervals on the wall, and 2 identical chairs positioned exactly 3 feet apart. The digital clock on my desk displayed the time in stark red numerals, 2 p.m. Marcus entered with his characteristic ritual: 3 knocks, pause, 3 more knocks, then a careful examination of the doorframe before crossing the threshold. He sat in his designated chair and immediately began arranging the items on my coffee. Table, tissue box centered, 2 pens parallel, water glass positioned at the exact midpoint between us. "How are you feeling today, Marcus?" I asked, opening his file. "The patterns are becoming clearer," he replied, adjusting the tissue box by millimeters. "Yesterday, I noticed that my breakfast plate cracked along a line that perfectly bisected the eggs. When I looked closer, the crack formed a mirror image of the crack in my bathroom mirror from last week. This was familiar territory. Marcus often found significance in coincidental symmetries, interpreting random events as part of larger patterns. I documented his observations while watching the clock, 2:15 p.m. "These patterns you've mentioned," I said, following our established therapeutic approach, "how do they make you feel when you notice them?" "Complete," he answered immediately. "Like everything is finally arranged the way it should be. But then..." He paused, realigning the pens. "Then I realized there's another pattern underneath, one that doesn't match." I glanced at the clock, 2:15 p.m., the same time it had shown moments before. The second hand wasn't moving. "Marcus, do you notice anything unusual about the room today?" He looked around methodically, examining each wall, each piece of furniture. "Everything appears to be in its proper position. Why do you ask?" "The clock seems to have stopped." He followed my gaze to the digital display, still reading 2:15. "Time often becomes irrelevant when patterns align properly," he said. "Which version of me do you prefer talking to?" The question struck me as odd, a departure from his usual concrete observations. "I'm not sure I understand." "We've had this conversation before," Marcus said, his voice taking on a different quality. More assured, less compulsive. "Many times, actually. You always notice the clock stopping at 2:15, and you always ask about the room feeling unusual." A chill ran down my spine. I reviewed his file quickly, looking for any notes about déjà vu or false memory symptoms. Nothing. Marcus had never displayed signs of temporal disorientation. "Marcus, what do you remember about our previous sessions?" "All of them," he replied. Word for word, gesture for gesture. "You lean forward when you're concerned, like you're doing now. You tap your pen 3 times when you're thinking, twice on the thinking, once on the conclusion." I realized I was indeed leaning forward, pen poised to tap against my notepad. I set it down carefully. "You document everything in that file," Marcus continued, "but you never read the previous session notes before we meet. If you did, you'd see that today's conversation appears in last week's documentation, and the week before that, and the week before that." With trembling fingers, I flipped backward through his file. The session notes from the previous week described our conversation in perfect detail, including his question about which version he preferred talking to and my confusion about the stopped clock. The notes from 2 weeks prior contained identical content, and 3 weeks before that. "This isn't possible," I whispered. "Patterns don't care about possibility," Marcus said. "They simply exist, repeating until someone recognizes them." He straightened the tissue box again. The question is whether we're repeating the pattern or the pattern is repeating us. I stood abruptly, needing to break whatever psychological cycle had trapped us. But as I moved toward the door, Marcus spoke again. You'll try to leave now, but the door won't open. Then you'll check your watch, and it will also show 2:15. You'll return to your chair and ask me to explain what's happening. My hand froze on the doorknob. I turned it, but the mechanism felt disconnected, as if the latch weren't engaging with the frame. I checked my watch. 2:15 p.m. I returned to my chair. Please explain what's happening. We're caught in a therapeutic loop, Marcus said calmly. Every session follows the same script because we haven't reached the resolution yet. You're trying to cure my obsession with patterns, but you haven't realized that this entire situation is a pattern, one that requires both of us to break it. What kind of resolution? The truth about why I was really referred to you. Marcus rearranged the pens again, but this time he placed them in a perfect X formation. I wasn't admitted for OCD, Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I was admitted because I claimed to remember conversations that hadn't happened yet. Sessions with a psychiatry resident who would become trapped in the same repeating hour, documenting the same interactions, trying to cure a patient who was already cured. The use of my full name sent ice through my veins. I hadn't introduced myself with my first name, and patients typically addressed me as Doctor. How do you know my name? Because we've been having this conversation for months, maybe years. The hospital clock outside shows different times when we're not in session, but in here it's always 2 out at 2:15. Always the same questions, the same revelations, the same moment when you realize you're not treating me. You're experiencing what I experienced. I flipped to the front of his file, looking for his admission date. The page was blank except for a single line. Patient 42, temporal displacement therapy, resident assigned, Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Session time, 2/2:15 p.m. Status, ongoing. What happens at 2:15? I asked. We reach the end of the loop, and you forget everything. Tomorrow, you'll arrive at 2 p.m. for our session, and we'll begin again. You'll notice the clock stop. I'll ask which version you prefer, and you'll slowly realize we've done this before. But the session notes are written by a version of you that exists only during this loop. Outside of 2 into 2:15, you have no memory of writing them. Marcus stood and moved to the window. The pattern isn't my obsession, Dr. Mitchell. It's your treatment method. You're trying to cure temporal displacement by experiencing it firsthand. That's not possible. I'm a resident. I don't have the authority to design experimental treatments. Check your credentials, he suggested gently. I opened my desk drawer where I kept my hospital ID badge. The photo showed my face, but the text read, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Senior Attending Psychiatrist, Temporal Psychology Division. The ID was dated 5 years in the future. You volunteered for this, Marcus explained. To understand patients like me, you agreed to experience the same temporal loop that brought me here. But somewhere in the repetition, you forgot that you weren't the doctor trying to cure the patient. You were the patient trying to cure yourself. The clock display flickered. 2:14:59. What happens when it reaches 2:15? You tell me to stop before we reach the ending again, Marcus said. Every time, as if you know what comes next but can't bear to experience it. The seconds ticked down. 2:14:58, 2:14:57, 2:14:56. Stop, I heard myself say. Please stop before we reach the ending again. Marcus smiled sadly. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Doctor, we'll try a different approach. The clock hit 2:15 and the world went white. I opened my eyes at my desk. The clock read 1:58 p.m. In 2 minutes, I had an appointment with patient 42, a man with obsessive-compulsive tendencies who found significance in patterns. I opened his file to review our treatment plan, but something nagged at me, a sense that we'd discussed temporal displacement before, though his diagnosis clearly indicated OCD. At 2 p.m. exactly, 3 knocks echoed from my door. Come in, Marcus, I called, though I couldn't remember deciding to use his first name. He entered and began arranging the items on my coffee table. The patterns are becoming clearer, he said. and somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew he was going to mention a cracked breakfast plate and a bathroom mirror. But this time, I decided to ask a different question first. "Marcus, have we met before today?" He paused in his arrangement of the pens, looked directly at me, and smiled. "Which version of me do you prefer talking to?" The clock stopped at 2:15 p.m., and I realized with growing dread that some therapeutic relationships never end. They just find new ways to repeat themselves until both doctor and patient forget which role they were originally meant to play. Safety rounds in the psychiatric ward followed a precise choreography developed over decades of institutional experience. Every 15 minutes, I walked the same route, down the main corridor, checked the common areas, verify patient locations, and return to the nurse's station. The mirrors mounted at each corner intersection were essential tools, angled to show blind spots where patients might congregate unsupervised, or where incidents could develop beyond direct observation. I'd been performing these rounds for 6 years, long enough that the routine had become automatic. The mirrors reflected familiar scenes: patients reading in the day room, staff members updating charts, the occasional wanderer who needed gentle redirection back to their room. The reflections provided an extra set of eyes, a way to see around corners and maintain the comprehensive awareness that psychiatric care demanded. The first anomaly occurred during my Tuesday evening shift. I was approaching the intersection between Ward B and the administration corridor when I caught sight of myself in the corner mirror. But my reflection was already at the intersection, clipboard in hand, writing notes. I stopped mid-step, confused. The reflection showed me documenting something on the patient observation form, but I hadn't reached that checkpoint yet. More unsettling, the reflection was writing with focused concentration, as if recording significant findings. I hurried to the intersection, expecting to find some optical illusion or trick of lighting that had created the false image. But when I reached the mirror's vantage point, I was alone in the corridor. The reflection I'd seen was gone, replaced by my current image looking puzzled and slightly shaken. I examined my clipboard. The observation form was blank. No notes, no check marks, no indication that I'd documented anything during this round. But as I stood there, I noticed something odd. The pen in my hand felt warm, as if it had been used recently. Over the following nights, the phenomenon repeated with increasing frequency. I would catch glimpses of my reflection arriving at checkpoints before I did, always engaged in the act of documentation. The reflected version moved with purpose and efficiency, suggesting it was observing something significant enough to warrant detailed notes. I began timing my rounds more carefully, noting the exact moments when I spotted these temporal reflections. The pattern was consistent. My mirror image appeared approximately 30 seconds before I reached each intersection, conducted what appeared to be thorough observations, then vanished when I arrived. Most disturbing was the reflection's apparent awareness of things I couldn't see. In the mirror, I watched myself point toward empty corridors, document interactions with patients who weren't present, and respond to situations that hadn't occurred. The reflected David Morrison was having a completely different experience of the same space. I decided to test the phenomenon by altering my routine. Instead of following the standard path, I took a detour through the rarely used East Wing. But when I passed the mirror at the end of that corridor, my reflection was there waiting, not surprised by the route change, but prepared for it, already documenting whatever it had observed in that location. The reflected version looked directly at me through the mirror, nodded with what seemed like approval, then returned to its clipboard. For a moment, we stood on opposite sides of the glass, identical except for our actions. My reflection was working while I watched in bewilderment. I examined the East Wing thoroughly, looking for anything that might justify the intensive documentation I'd witnessed. The area was empty, clean, and unremarkable. No patients, no incidents, no reason for the detailed observations my reflection had been conducting. But that night, I received a call from Dr. Sarah Mitchell in Ward B. A patient named Marcus Wellington had experienced an episode during evening hours, exactly when I'd seen my reflection documenting something in the East Wing. Marcus had claimed he could see through walls and had provided accurate descriptions of activities occurring in areas beyond his visual range. He specifically mentioned seeing a night technician taking detailed notes in the East Wing, Dr. Mitchell explained. But according to the duty roster, no one was assigned to that area. I didn't mention what I'd experienced. Instead, I asked to review Marcus's file. His condition involved temporal displacement, difficulty distinguishing between past, present, and future events. Dr. Mitchell's notes indicated that Marcus often described conversations and incidents before they occurred. Has he mentioned seeing staff members in mirrors? I asked, frequently. He claims the mirrors show what's really happening while we only see what we expect to see. Dr. Mitchell paused. Why do you ask? Just curious about his perceptual experiences, but I was more than curious. I was beginning to suspect that Marcus's temporal displacement and my mirror phenomenon were connected, two aspects of the same disruption in the ward's normal flow of time and observation. The next evening, I brought a small digital camera to document what the mirrors were showing. When I spotted my reflection at the Ward B intersection, I photographed both the mirror and the actual corridor. Later, reviewing the images, I found something impossible. The photograph of the mirror showed my reflection documenting a patient interaction, while the photograph of the actual corridor showed empty space. But in the corner of the mirror photo, barely visible, was a figure I recognized, Marcus Wellington, standing in a location where he shouldn't have been able to access, watching my reflection with intense concentration. I printed the photograph and brought it to Dr. Mitchell. This was taken last night during rounds. Can you explain what you see? She studied the image carefully. That appears to be you conducting standard observations, but... She pointed to Marcus's figure. He was in his room under supervision at that time. How could he be in two places simultaneously? Maybe he wasn't in two places, I suggested. Maybe the mirror is showing a different time than the one we're experiencing. Dr. Mitchell's expression shifted from confusion to professional concern. David, are you experiencing any temporal displacement symptoms yourself? Difficulty with sequence of events, feeling like you've done things before, seeing things that don't match current reality. I realized I was describing exactly what I'd been experiencing. You think I have the same condition as Marcus? I think you've been exposed to something in this ward that affects perception of time and causality. Have you been taking any medications, experiencing unusual stress, or the mirrors? I interrupted. It started with the mirrors. She nodded slowly. Several staff members have reported perceptual anomalies related to the mirror system. We assumed it was fatigue or stress, but the reports are becoming too consistent to dismiss. That night, I arrived for my shift with new instructions from Dr. Mitchell. Conduct normal rounds, but avoid looking directly at the mirrors. If I needed to check blind spots, use peripheral vision only. No sustained eye contact with reflective surfaces. The restriction felt unnatural after years of relying on the mirrors for comprehensive surveillance. I found myself moving more cautiously, unsure of what lay around each corner. Without the reflected advance warning, I felt blind and vulnerable. But at the Ward B intersection, I couldn't resist a quick glance. My reflection was there, as always, arriving 30 seconds early and documenting intensively. This time, however, it looked up from its clipboard and pointed directly at me. In the reflection, I saw Marcus Wellington standing beside the mirrored version of myself, both of them watching me with expressions of patient waiting. Marcus raised his hand and mouthed words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Time to switch places. My reflection set down its clipboard and walked toward the surface of the mirror. As it approached, I felt an irresistible pull forward. The boundary between the reflection and reality began to blur, and I realized that the documented observations I'd been seeing weren't predictions of the future. They were records of what I'd already done. In a time stream that ran parallel to my conscious experience, I pressed my palm against the mirror's surface. The glass felt warm, yielding, like water rather than solid matter. My reflection pressed its palm against mine from the other side, and in that moment of contact, our experiences merged. I understood then that the mirrors didn't show alternate realities. They showed the complete picture. My conscious self could only perceive one timeline at a time, but the reflections revealed all the simultaneous possibilities, all the parallel duties I was performing across different temporal layers of the ward. As I stepped forward into the mirror, I felt the familiar weight of the clipboard in my hand and realized I was finally ready to document what I'd been observing all along. Behind me, my previous self walked away from the intersection, relieved of the responsibility to see everything at once. The rounds continue, but now I conduct them from both sides of the mirror, watching the present while documenting the future, ensuring that every temporal layer of the ward receives the attention it requires. And sometimes, when new technicians catch glimpses of their reflections acting independently, I know they're ready to understand that some observations require seeing beyond the single moment we think we inhabit. The mirrors don't lie. They just show us more than we're usually prepared to see. "23 years of night custodial work had taught me that hospitals possess their own rhythm after dark. The daytime chaos of medical procedures, visitor traffic, and staff coordination gave way to something quieter, but no less complex. The careful maintenance of sterile environments, the systematic cleaning of spaces where healing and death intersected daily. My route through Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital followed the same pattern every night. Start with the administrative offices, work through the patient wards methodically, finish with the common areas and corridors. The work provided a meditative quality that suited my temperament. There's something deeply satisfying about transforming soiled spaces into clean ones, about maintaining order in environments where chaos threatens constantly. Each night I restored the hospital to its pristine state, ready for the next day's challenges. My equipment was simple but efficient. Industrial mop bucket, disinfectant solutions, polishing cloths, and a careful understanding of which areas required special attention. The psychiatric ward demanded particular vigilance. Patients sometimes left traces of their distress in unexpected places, and maintaining a clean environment was essential for both psychological and physical health. The corridor system formed a logical grid, main arteries running north-south and east-west, connected by smaller hallways that provided access to patient rooms, offices, and utility areas. I'd mapped this layout in my mind so thoroughly that I could navigate it in complete darkness. Each corridor had specific cleaning requirements, specific timing considerations, specific challenges. The North Hall had always been part of my route, though I couldn't recall when it had been added to my responsibilities. It ran parallel to the main psychiatric ward, providing access to what I assumed were administrative offices or storage areas. The doors were always locked, marked only with numerical designations, so I focused on maintaining the corridor itself, mopping the tile floors, wiping down the handrails, ensuring the overhead lights remained clean and functional. The first sign of something unusual occurred during my Tuesday night shift. I was halfway through mopping the North Hall when I realized I'd been walking for longer than the corridor's architecture should have allowed. The hall typically measured about 200 feet from end to end, but I'd been mopping steadily for 10 minutes without reaching the far exit. I looked back toward the entrance where I'd started. The doorway was visible, but much farther away than it should have been, as if the corridor had stretched while I worked. The distance appeared to be at least 500 feet, triple the normal length. I continued forward, assuming fatigue was affecting my depth perception. Night shifts often created optical illusions, particularly in long, repetitive spaces like hospital corridors. But as I walked, the hall seemed to extend further ahead of me. Each step forward moved the far exit further away, as if I were on some kind of architectural treadmill. The mopping became automatic while I tried to understand what was happening. The floor tiles continued in their regular pattern. The overhead fluorescents maintained their steady rhythm. The numbered doors appeared at consistent intervals. Everything looked normal except for the impossible distance I was covering. After what felt like an hour of continuous mopping, I stopped and examined my bucket. The water remained clean despite having covered what should have been thousands of square feet of hospital flooring. When I tested the floor behind me, it was dry and gleaming, showing the results of recent cleaning. But the floor ahead remained untouched, waiting for attention. I decided to abandon the systematic approach and walk directly to the far exit without mopping. But as I moved forward carrying my equipment, the corridor continued to extend. The exit remained visible but unreachable, always the same distance ahead no matter how long I walked. The silence in the extended corridor was different from normal hospital quiet. There was an absence of the usual background sounds. No ventilation systems, no distant conversations, no electronic beeping from patient monitors. just the echo of my footsteps and the faint hum of fluorescent lights that seemed to stretch infinitely overhead. After several hours of walking, I noticed something that made me stop completely. Footprints in the clean tile floor ahead of me. Not wet footprints that would have been left by someone walking through recently mopped areas, but the kind of dusty impressions that appear when someone walks across a floor that hasn't been cleaned in a long time. The footprints were multiple and overlapping. Different sizes, different patterns, suggesting several people had walked this extended corridor recently, but that was impossible. I was the only person authorized to access this area during night hours, and the doors to patient rooms were locked. I followed the footprint trail, which led to one of the numbered doors, room 247. Unlike the other doors I'd passed, this one stood slightly ajar, showing darkness beyond. The footprints disappeared through the doorway. I pushed the door open carefully. The room beyond was larger than the architectural layout should have permitted, extending back into shadows that the corridor's lighting couldn't penetrate. Patient beds lined the walls, occupied by figures I could barely make out in the darkness. "Excuse me," I called softly. "Visiting hours are over. You need to return to your assigned rooms." One of the figures sat up in bed, an elderly woman wearing a hospital gown that looked decades out of date. "Are you here to clean our room?" she asked. "It's been so dusty lately." I looked around the space more carefully. The room was indeed dusty, showing signs of neglect that contradicted my nightly cleaning routine. Cobwebs hung from the corners. The floor was covered with a thin layer of grime, and the air held the stale quality of spaces that hadn't been properly ventilated in months. "When was this room last cleaned?" I asked. "Not since the hall was extended," another patient replied from across the room. "The custodian comes by every night, but he never reaches our section." "I'm the custodian," I said. "I clean this corridor every night." "You clean the beginning of the corridor," the elderly woman corrected. "But the corridor keeps growing. New rooms are added, new patients arrive, but the cleaning never catches up." I examined the room more closely. The patient beds looked authentic, the medical equipment appeared functional, and the people occupying the space seemed genuinely ill and in need of care. But according to hospital records, room 247 was just a maintenance closet. "How long have you been patients here?" I asked. "Since the extension began," the woman replied. "Time moves differently in the North Hall. Days and nights blend together. But we always know when you're coming because we can hear the mop bucket getting closer. But I never reach you, because the corridor grows faster than you can clean it. Each night, more rooms are added, more patients arrive, more space needs attention. You spend your entire shift trying to complete a task that becomes larger while you work." I left room 247 and continued down the corridor, checking other doors. Each room I entered contained patients who had been waiting for cleaning services, for basic maintenance, for the kind of care that kept institutional spaces habitable. All of them recognized me, knew my routine, understood my struggle to reach them. "You've been trying to clean this hall for months," one patient explained. "Every night you start at the beginning and work your way forward. But by the time you reach our section, your shift is over and you have to start again. That's impossible. I complete my entire route every night." "You complete the original route," he clarified. "But the hospital keeps expanding. New wings, new corridors, new patient rooms. The cleaning requirements grow faster than any one person can handle." I realized he was describing something I'd felt but hadn't acknowledged. The gradual increase in my workload, the growing sense that each night's tasks were taking longer to complete, the creeping exhaustion that came from trying to maintain standards across an ever-expanding facility. "What happened to the other custodians?" I asked. "There were others," the patient replied, "but they all got lost in the extended corridors eventually. They kept walking forward, trying to reach the end of their routes, but the halls kept growing. Eventually, they just became part of the hospital's infinite maintenance needs." I thought about my colleagues who had transferred to other facilities, retired early, or simply stopped showing up for work. I'd attributed their departures to normal job turnover, but now I wondered if they had encountered the same impossible corridors, the same endlessly expanding cleaning requirements. "Is there a way out?" I asked. "Only if you stop trying to clean everything," the woman from room 247 said. She had followed me into the corridor, along with several other patients. "The hospital depends on the idea that every space can be maintained, every area can be kept clean. But some spaces exist beyond maintenance. They grow specifically because someone is trying to control them. I looked back down the corridor toward where I'd started. The entrance was no longer visible, just an endless hallway stretching in both directions, lined with patient rooms that needed attention, filled with people who required care. If I stop cleaning, what happens to all of you? We continue existing, she replied. But we stop expanding. The corridor stops growing when the cleaning stops trying to catch up. I set down my mop bucket and examined the water. It was still clean, still ready for use, despite having covered impossible distances. The cleaning solution remained effective. The equipment remained functional. Only the space itself had proven infinite. You can return to the beginning, one of the patients suggested. Resume your normal route through the documented areas of the hospital. But you'll have to accept that some corridors exist beyond your ability to clean them. I realized he was offering me a choice. Continue the endless pursuit of complete maintenance, or accept that some aspects of institutional care transcend individual effort. The patients in the extended corridor would continue to exist whether I cleaned their rooms or not. The question was whether I would spend eternity trying to reach them or acknowledge that some needs exist beyond the scope of any single custodian's duties. I picked up my equipment and began walking, back toward the original entrance to North Hall. The corridor slowly contracted as I moved, the patient rooms receding into architectural possibility, the impossible distances returning to manageable proportions. But I knew the extension would return the next night, and the night after that, whenever I tried to clean the North Hall completely. The patients would continue waiting in their dusty rooms, understanding that institutional care involves both the maintenance we can complete and the infinite needs that stretch beyond any individual's capacity to address. Mop water still carries their footprints, evidence of patients who exist in the space between what can be cleaned and what must simply be accepted. Each night, I hear them singing softly from their extended rooms, reminding me that some aspects of caring for others require acknowledging the limits of what one person can accomplish. The corridor may be endless, but the choice to walk it remains finite. And in that choice lies the difference between being consumed by impossible tasks and finding peace in doing what can be done. Medication management in the psychiatric ward demanded absolute precision. Every pill counted, every dosage documented, every administration verified through multiple checkpoints designed to prevent errors that could prove catastrophic for vulnerable patients. My morning routine began at 6 a.m. with a systematic review of medication charts, cross-referencing doctor's orders with pharmacy supplies, preparing individual doses in locked medication carts that would accompany me through the ward. The process was methodical and comforting in its predictability. Each patient received their prescribed medications at specific times, signed for receipt on forms that created a paper trail of therapeutic compliance, and was monitored for adverse reactions or therapeutic response. After 15 years of psychiatric nursing, I developed an intuitive understanding of which patients needed encouragement to take their medications, which required careful monitoring for side effects, and which showed signs of improvement or deterioration. Patient medications were stored in a central pharmacy room adjacent to the nurse's station, organized by patient name and dosage schedule. Morning medications were prepared and distributed between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., with specific timing requirements for certain psychiatric drugs that needed to be administered on empty stomachs or at precise intervals. The Medication Administration Record, MR, served as both legal document and clinical tool, tracking every pill dispensed and consumed. The first anomaly occurred with Michael Patterson, a young man being treated for severe depression with a combination of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. At 8:15 a.m., I administered his prescribed dosages, 50 mg sertraline, 1 mg lorazepam, Marior's quetiapine, and watched him take each pill while I documented the administration in his MAR. 2 hours later, Michael appeared at the medication cart again. "Time for my morning meds," he said, extending his hand for the familiar routine. I checked his chart. According to my documentation, he'd already received his 8:15 a.m. doses. The MAR showed his signature confirming receipt, witnessed by my initials. But Michael seemed genuinely confused when I explained he'd already taken his medications. "I haven't been to see you yet today," he insisted. "I just woke up and came for my morning pills." I showed him the signed MAR entry. The signature was clearly his, The distinctive way he wrote his last name, the small circle he used instead of a dot over the I in Michael. But he stared at the signature with complete bewilderment. "That's my handwriting," he admitted, "but I don't remember signing this." I checked the medication drawer. Michael's morning doses were missing, the pills I'd watched him take 2 hours earlier. But if he'd already consumed them, why did he have no memory of the interaction? And why was he requesting the same medications again? I contacted Dr. Williams, Michael's attending psychiatrist, to report the incident. He suggested that memory gaps could be a side effect of the lorazepam, particularly if Michael was experiencing unusual stress or sleep disruption. We agreed to monitor the situation closely, but the following morning the same pattern repeated. Michael appeared for his 8:15 a.m. medications, took them willingly, signed the MAR with his distinctive handwriting. 2 hours later he returned, insisting he hadn't received his morning doses. The MAR showed both interactions, 2 identical signatures, 2 sets of initials from me, 2 administrations of the same medications. The pharmacy confirmed that double doses were being dispensed. Michael's prescribed medications were disappearing from inventory twice as quickly as they should, suggesting he was actually consuming multiple doses rather than imagining the need for them. More concerning, Michael's therapeutic response wasn't matching the medication levels. Despite consuming double doses of his antidepressants, his mood remained stable rather than showing signs of overdose or accelerated improvement. It was as if the extra medications were having no cumulative effect. I began documenting the duplicate administrations more carefully, noting exact times, Michael's mental state during each interaction, and any differences in his presentation. The pattern was remarkably consistent. At 8:15 a.m. he would appear alert and cooperative, take his medications, sign the MAR, and return to his room. At 10:15 a.m. he would appear equally alert and cooperative, insist he hadn't received morning medications, and repeat the exact same process. During the second administration, I would show him his earlier signature. He would examine it carefully, acknowledge it was his handwriting, but maintain complete amnesia about the first interaction. It wasn't the confused denial of someone trying to obtain extra medications. It was the genuine bewilderment of someone encountering evidence of actions they couldn't remember performing. The breakthrough came when I decided to involve Michael in solving the mystery. During his first medication administration, I asked him to write a brief note about how he was feeling that morning. He wrote, "Feeling okay today, ready to start working on recovery." During his second appearance, I showed him the note along with his MAR signature. "I wrote this?" he asked, studying his own handwriting. "2 hours ago, when you took your morning medications." He read the note several times. "But I feel like I just woke up. I don't remember writing about being ready for recovery. I mean, I am ready, but..." He paused. "It's like reading something written by someone who has the same thoughts I do, but experienced them at a different time. I decided to test something. Michael, what do you remember about yesterday?" "Yesterday I talked to Dr. Williams about adjusting my medication schedule. He said we might try taking the morning doses earlier, around 8:15 instead of 9:1. But according to my records, that conversation had happened a week ago. Michael's morning medications had been administered at 8:15 for the past 7 days. Yet from his perspective, the schedule change was happening for the first time each day. I reviewed his entire MR chart. The medication signatures showed an impossible pattern. Each day's entries appeared to be written by the same person, but at different stages of treatment. Some signatures were shaky, suggesting early medication adjustment periods. Others were confident, indicating therapeutic stability. A few showed signs of the hand tremors that typically develop weeks into certain psychiatric medications. The signatures were all definitely Michael's, but they represented different points in his treatment timeline. It was as if multiple versions of his therapeutic journey were occurring simultaneously, each requiring the same medications at the same times. Dr. Williams was initially skeptical of my observations, but agreed to personally witness Michael's dual medication requests. On Friday morning, he observed both interactions, Michael taking his 8:15 a.m. doses cooperatively, then returning at 10:15 a.m. with no memory of the first administration. "Michael," Dr. Williams asked during the second interaction, "what day do you think it is?" "Friday, October 15th, my 3rd week in the hospital." Dr. Williams checked the calendar. It was indeed Friday, October 15th, but Michael had been a patient for over 2 months. What do you remember about your treatment so far? We've been adjusting my medications, trying to find the right combination. I think we're getting close. I've been feeling more stable lately. Dr. Williams reviewed Michael's actual treatment history. The description matched his condition exactly 3 weeks into his admission, when we'd been fine-tuning his medication regimen. But Michael was currently in week 10 of treatment, showing significant improvement and preparing for discharge planning. He's experiencing multiple points in his treatment timeline simultaneously, Dr. Williams concluded. The morning medications he's taking correspond to different stages of his therapy. The 8:15 a.m. dose is for his current therapeutic needs, but the 10:15 a.m. dose is for his needs from several weeks ago. But he's physically taking both doses, I pointed out. The medications are disappearing from inventory, because both treatment stages are equally real for him. His consciousness is accessing different temporal points in his recovery, and each point requires appropriate pharmaceutical intervention. We developed a modified administration protocol. Instead of trying to prevent the duplicate dosing, we prepared medications appropriate for both stages of Michael's treatment. Current doses for his morning presentation, earlier stage doses for his later presentation. The pharmacy created separate inventories for what they labeled temporal therapeutic needs. Michael's condition stabilized. Both versions of his treatment timeline progressed normally, and gradually, the time gap between his presentations decreased. Instead of appearing 2 hours apart, he would return after 1 hour, then 30 minutes, then 15 minutes, until finally, both aspects of his treatment occurred simultaneously. On his discharge day, Michael signed 2 sets of release forms, one for each timeline he'd experienced. Both signatures were identical, written at the same moment by what appeared to be the same person, but documenting different durations of hospital stay and different treatment outcomes. "Thank you for taking care of both versions of me," he said as he prepared to leave. "I know it was confusing, but I needed medication for who I was and who I was becoming simultaneously." After Michael's discharge, I found a note in my medication cart written in handwriting I recognized but couldn't place. Some healing requires treating the patient across multiple stages of recovery simultaneously. The medications work because they address needs that exist in different temporal layers of the same therapeutic journey. The handwriting was mine, though I had no memory of writing the note. Below it was another line in different ink. "Next week, you'll understand why some prescriptions refill themselves. I've started paying closer attention to patients who return for medications they've already received. Each time I'm discovering that some therapeutic needs exist across multiple timelines, requiring careful documentation of treatments that serve both who patients are and who they're becoming through the healing process. The medication cycle continues. But now I understand that some prescriptions address not just current symptoms, but the temporal complexity of recovery itself. In the space between administration and effect, healing creates its own timeline, and sometimes the cure exists in multiple moments simultaneously." Discharge planning represented the most satisfying aspect of psychiatric practice, the moment when months of careful treatment culminated in a patient's successful return to independent living. Each discharge required comprehensive documentation, treatment summary, medication management plans, outpatient referrals, and follow-up scheduling. The paperwork served as both legal protection and clinical continuity, ensuring that patients transitioned safely from inpatient care to community-based support systems. Ellis Williams had been one of my most successful cases. Admitted in March 2018 with severe depression following a job loss and relationship breakdown, he had responded well to a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy and antidepressant medication. Over 6 months of treatment, Ellis had progressed from acute suicidal ideation to stable mood management, developing coping strategies that would serve him in outpatient settings. His discharge on September 15, 2018, followed standard protocols. I completed his treatment summary, documenting significant therapeutic milestones, medication effectiveness, and recommendations for ongoing care. Ellis signed the discharge paperwork with obvious relief and gratitude, thanking me for helping him find a way back to life. "Dr. Catherine, you saved me," he said, using the informal address that many long-term patients adopted. "I won't forget what you've done." I provided him with referrals to community mental health services, a 3-month supply of medications, and my standard advice about maintaining the therapeutic gains he'd achieved during hospitalization. Ellis shook my hand firmly, collected his personal belongings, and walked out of the hospital with the confident stride of someone who had successfully completed a difficult journey. I filed his discharge, paperwork in the completed cases section, and moved on to other patients who required attention. Ellis Williams represented the kind of therapeutic success that made psychiatric work rewarding. A person who had entered treatment in crisis and left with tools for sustained recovery. 3 years later, on September 15, 2021, Ellis Williams appeared in my office for discharge planning. I stared at him in confusion. He looked exactly as he had in 2018, same age, same appearance, same mannerisms. He was wearing the same clothes he'd worn during his previous discharge, carrying the same personal belongings in the same worn duffel bag. Ellis? What are you doing here? I'm ready for discharge, Dr. Catherine. I think we've accomplished everything we set out to do. I opened my computer and searched for his current patient record. According to the hospital database, Ellis Williams was not currently admitted. His most recent record showed successful discharge on September 15, 2018, with no subsequent admissions or contacts. Ellis, you were discharged 3 years ago. You haven't been a patient here since 2018. He looked genuinely puzzled. I've been working with you for 6 months. We've been doing CBT sessions, adjusting my medications, preparing for my return to independent living. Today is my discharge date. I pulled up his 2018 file, reviewing the treatment notes and discharge documentation. Every detail Ellis mentioned matched his previous admission exactly. The therapeutic approaches, the medication adjustments, the timeline of his recovery. But the dates showed that treatment had concluded years ago. Ellis, do you remember being discharged before? No, this is my first time leaving the hospital. I've never been discharged before. He paused, looking around my office with the familiarity of someone who had spent many sessions in the same space. Why would you ask that? I showed him the 2018 discharge paperwork on my computer screen. This is your signature, dated 3 years ago. He examined the document carefully. That's definitely my signature, and these treatment notes describe exactly what we've been working on. But I don't understand. If I was discharged 3 years ago, why am I still here? I had no answer. According to every official record, Ellis Williams had completed treatment and left the hospital in 2018. Yet he was sitting in my office in 2021, exhibiting the same therapeutic gains, requesting the same discharge planning, showing the same readiness for independent living. I decided to complete the discharge process, assuming some administrative error had occurred. Perhaps Ellis had been readmitted through a different system, or there had been a clerical mistake in the database. I prepared new discharge paperwork, documenting his current stable condition and readiness for outpatient care. Ellis signed the forms with the same relief and gratitude he'd shown 3 years earlier. Dr. Catherine, you saved me, he said, using the exact same words, the same tone, the same grateful expression. I won't forget what you've done. The déjà vu was overwhelming. I provided him with the same referrals, the same medication supply, the same advice about maintaining his therapeutic gains. Ellis shook my hand with the same firm grip, collected his belongings in the same worn duffel bag, and walked out with the same confident stride. After he left, I compared the 2 discharge documents. The paperwork was identical except for the dates. Same treatment summary, same medication management plan, same outpatient referrals. Even Ellis's signature was identical, showing the same pen pressure, the same letter formation, the same slight tremor from medication side effects. I contacted the community mental health center that had been his outpatient referral in 2018. According to their records, Ellis Williams had never appeared for his scheduled follow-up appointments. They had attempted to contact him multiple times, but he seemed to have vanished after discharge. I tried calling the phone number Ellis had provided during both admissions. The number was disconnected. I looked up his home address in the hospital database. The building had been demolished in 2019 to make way for a shopping center. Ellis Williams had been discharged twice, but there was no evidence that he had ever actually left the hospital. I began reviewing other successful discharge cases from my caseload, looking for similar anomalies. The pattern was disturbing. Several patients had been discharged multiple times, often years apart, with identical paperwork and identical presentations. In each case, the patients had no memory of previous discharges and no traceable presence in outpatient settings. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, my supervisor, was initially skeptical of my findings. Patients sometimes return for readmission, she pointed out. Perhaps Ellis was readmitted through emergency services or a different facility. But he had no memory of being discharged before, and all his paperwork was identical. It's as if the same discharge was happening repeatedly. Dr. Mitchell agreed to review the cases I'd identified. Her analysis confirmed the pattern. Patients who appeared to complete treatment successfully, but whose discharges seemed to exist independently of normal temporal sequence. It's possible, she suggested, that these patients are experiencing therapeutic completion at a psychological level that doesn't correspond to chronological time. The discharge represents their internal readiness to leave treatment, regardless of when that readiness occurs relative to external schedules. But where do they go when they're discharged? Perhaps, Dr. Mitchell said quietly, they go to wherever people go when they've completed the psychological work of healing, even if that place doesn't correspond to our physical understanding of post-treatment life. This week, I received notification that Ellis Williams has been scheduled for discharge planning. The appointment is set for September 15, 2024, exactly 3 years after his second discharge. 6 years after his first, I prepared the same paperwork, gathered the same referrals, reviewed the same treatment notes. When Ellis arrives, he'll show the same therapeutic gains, the same readiness for independent living, the same gratitude for treatment that helped him find a way back to life. And I'll complete his discharge once again, knowing that successful treatment sometimes creates its own temporal cycle, where healing becomes a recursive process that transcends the linear progression from admission to discharge. Some patients never truly leave the hospital, not because treatment has failed, but because their healing creates a kind of therapeutic permanence, a recurring completion that exists outside normal chronological boundaries. Ellis Williams represents the possibility that psychiatric recovery involves not just individual healing, but the creation of healing moments that repeat across time, ensuring that the therapeutic work continues to serve both patient and practitioner in ways that transcend standard discharge protocols. The paperwork will be identical. The gratitude will be genuine and somewhere in the space between repeated discharges. Ellis Williams will continue to represent the kind of therapeutic success that reminds me why psychiatric work matters, even when that success exists in dimensions of time I don't fully understand. The digitization project at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital was meant to be routine administrative work, converting decades of security footage from analog videotapes to digital formats for legal compliance and storage efficiency. Ward 6 had been sealed since 1978 following what hospital? Records vaguely described as operational restructuring, but the legal department required preservation of all surveillance materials for potential litigation or historical research purposes. My assignment was straightforward. Transfer the Ward 6 security tapes to digital format, catalog them by date and camera location, upload them to the secure server system, and dispose of the original analog materials according to institutional protocols. The work was solitary and methodical, exactly the kind of detail-oriented task that suited my background in information systems and my preference for projects. That could be completed independently. The Ward 6 tape collection filled an entire storage room in the hospital's basement archives. Hundreds of VHS cassettes organized by year and camera station documented daily operations from the ward's opening in 1963 through its closure in 1978. The tapes covered routine activities, patient interactions, staff meetings, medical procedures, and the general institutional rhythms of psychiatric care during that era. I set up a conversion station in the archives room, connecting analog playback equipment to digital capture software that would preserve the footage while allowing for quality enhancement and indexing. The process was time-consuming but straightforward. Load a tape, begin conversion, monitor for technical issues, and move to the next cassette while the computer processed the digital file. The early tapes showed typical hospital operations from the 1960s and 1970s. The visual quality was poor by contemporary standards, and the content was unremarkable. Nurses conducting medication rounds, patients participating in group activities, maintenance staff performing routine duties. The clothing, hairstyles, and equipment provided interesting historical context, but nothing that seemed to warrant special attention. The first anomaly occurred while processing a tape labeled Ward 6, Station 3, October 1978. I was working late in the archives, letting the conversion software run while I organized the next batch of tapes for processing. The monitor showed the usual grainy black and white footage of a hospital corridor, with occasional staff members or patients passing through the camera's field of view. Then one of the patients on screen stopped walking, turned directly toward the camera, and spoke clearly. "Hello, Marcus. How's the digitization project coming along?" I stopped what I was doing and stared at the monitor. The patient on screen was looking directly at the camera with an expression of casual familiarity, as if we were having a normal conversation. But the footage was from 1978, 15 years before I was born. I rewound the tape and played the segment again. The patient repeated exactly the same action, stopping, turning toward the camera, addressing me by name. The audio quality was poor, but the words were unmistakable. "Hello, Marcus." I checked the tape label and conversion software settings, assuming some kind of technical error or audio contamination. But the metadata confirmed this was original footage from October 1978, and the audio track contained only the sounds present during the original recording. I decided to continue with the conversion process, attributing the incident to fatigue or acoustic pareidolia, the tendency to interpret random sounds as familiar words. But as I processed more tapes from the final months of Ward 6's operation, the direct addresses became more frequent and more specific. Patients would look up from their activities, make eye contact with the camera, and speak to me directly. "Marcus, you're working too late again. Your mother called. She's worried about you spending so much time in the basement. The coffee in the break room is getting cold." The personal details were accurate in ways that unsettled me deeply. My mother had indeed called that evening, concerned about my long hours on the digitization project. I had left coffee in the break room that was probably cold by now, but these were contemporary facts about my current life, not historical information that could have been recorded in 1978. I began documenting the anomalous addresses, noting timestamps, camera locations, and the specific content of each message. The pattern was consistent. Patients in the final weeks before Ward 6's closure seemed aware of my presence in the archives room, commenting on my work, my schedule, my personal circumstances. Most disturbing were the patients who provided information about my family history that I'd never shared with anyone at the hospital. One elderly woman looked directly at the camera and said, "Marcus, your grandfather would be proud of the work you're doing. He always believed in preserving important records. My grandfather had died when I was 7 years old. He'd worked as a hospital administrator, and I had vague childhood memories of him emphasizing the importance of maintaining accurate institutional records. But I'd never mentioned this family connection to any of my colleagues at Millbrook. I brought the anomalous footage to my supervisor, James Wilson, who was initially skeptical of my reports. "Audio from 1978 tapes can be distorted," he pointed out. "You might be hearing patterns that aren't really there." I showed him several clear examples of patients addressing me by name. James watched the footage carefully, then checked the tape labels and conversion metadata. "This is definitely original material from 1978, he confirmed, "but the audio quality is unusually clear for tapes this old. Most of our archive footage from that era has significant deterioration." "The patients are talking about current events," I explained. "They're commenting on things happening right now, in 2023. James agreed to observe the conversion process directly. That evening, we worked together in the archives room, processing tapes from Ward 6's final week of operation. At 11:30 p.m., a patient on screen looked up from a chess game and spoke clearly. "Good evening, Mr. Wilson. Marcus has been telling us about the digitization project. We're glad our stories will be preserved." James stared at the monitor in shock. That patient just addressed me by name. "But I've never worked with Ward 6 materials before tonight." We continued watching. Other patients began acknowledging both of us, discussing the conversion project, expressing appreciation that their experiences were being preserved for future research. They spoke with knowledge of contemporary hospital operations, current staff members, recent policy changes, information that couldn't possibly have been available in 1978. "How do they know about current hospital operations?" James asked. Maybe, I suggested. The tapes are somehow recording the present while we're viewing the past. The conversion process is creating a temporal connection between 1978 and now. We decided to test this hypothesis. James left the archives room while I continued the conversion process. Immediately, the patients on screen began commenting on his absence. Mr. Wilson stepped out for coffee. He'll be back in 10 minutes. He's calling the hospital administration to report the anomalous footage. Both observations proved accurate. James returned 10 minutes later with coffee, and he confirmed that he'd called the night administrator to report our findings. The patients can observe us in real time, he said. Somehow, the Ward 6 tapes are showing historical footage that's aware of contemporary viewers. We processed the final tape in the Ward 6 collection, security footage from the last day of operation, November 15, 1978. The tape showed patients and staff preparing for the ward's closure, packing belongings, completing final documentation, saying goodbye to colleagues and patients who would be transferred to other facilities. But instead of ending with the ward's closure, the footage continued. The camera showed the empty corridors and rooms of Ward 6 after the official closure, but the spaces weren't abandoned. Patients continued to move through the hallways. Staff members continued their duties. The normal rhythms of hospital operation continued despite the ward's official shutdown. Ward 6 never really closed, one of the patients explained, looking directly at the camera. We continued our treatment, our recovery, our daily routines. But we existed only in the security footage, waiting for someone to digitize our experiences and acknowledge that we were still here. The final segment of the tape showed all the Ward 6 patients gathered in the common room, looking directly at the camera. They spoke in unison. Thank you, Marcus and Mr. Wilson, for preserving our stories. The digitization project allowed us to connect across time, to share our experiences with people who could understand the importance of institutional memory. As the tape ended, my reflection appeared in the monitor screen. But I wasn't alone. Standing beside me were all the patients from Ward 6, visible in the reflection but not in the actual archives room. You'll find our stories in the digital files, my reflection said, though I wasn't speaking. But more importantly, you'll find yourselves becoming part of the continuing story of Ward 6. Some institutional records don't just preserve the past, they create ongoing connections between historical experiences and contemporary understanding. The conversion project was completed, but the digital files contained more than historical documentation. Each video file included contemporary footage of James and me working in the archives, conversations with patients from 1978 who commented on current hospital operations, and evidence of ongoing activities in Ward 6 despite its official closure decades ago. The hospital administration filed the materials as Historical Archives, Ward 6 Operations, 1963, present, acknowledging that some institutional memory transcends chronological boundaries. The digital preservation had somehow preserved not just past events, but the continuing presence of people whose experiences deserve documentation, regardless of their temporal relationship to contemporary hospital operations. I've been assigned to monitor the Ward 6 digital archive, ensuring that the ongoing activities documented in the footage receive appropriate attention and care. Each week, new footage appears in the digital files, patients continuing their treatment, staff providing ongoing care, institutional operations that exist in the preserved time of security documentation. The patients still address me by name when I review the footage, updating me on their progress, asking about my family, expressing appreciation that their experiences remain part of the hospital's living memory. And sometimes, late at night in the archives room, I catch glimpses of Ward 6 patients in reflective surfaces, reminding me that some stories continue to unfold long after their official endings, waiting for observers who understand that preservation means more than just maintaining historical records. It means acknowledging that some experiences transcend the boundaries between past and present, between documentation and reality. The tapes preserve everything: the patient's ongoing lives, my growing connection to their experiences, and the curious responsibility of maintaining institutional memory that refuses to remain merely historical. Administrative accuracy in psychiatric hospital operations required meticulous attention to patient census data, the daily documentation of who was admitted, who was discharged, who occupied which rooms, and who was receiving which treatments. As the psychiatric administrator responsible for census management, I maintained the institutional records that served as the foundation for medical billing, staffing decisions, legal compliance, and quality assurance reporting. The audit request from the State Regulatory Board arrived on a Monday morning in November. A comprehensive review of patient census records for the previous 6 months, requiring verification that our documentation systems accurately reflected the reality of patient care at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. The audit would compare our internal records with insurance filings, medication dispensing logs, and treatment documentation to ensure complete alignment across all data systems. I welcomed the audit opportunity. Our record keeping had always been exemplary, and I took professional pride in maintaining census data that could withstand the most rigorous scrutiny. The electronic patient management system automatically cross-referenced admission dates, room assignments, treatment authorizations, and discharge planning, creating an integrated database that eliminated most opportunities for human error. The audit process began with a systematic review of census reports, starting with current patient population and working backward through recent admissions and discharges. I printed comprehensive reports covering the 6-month period, organized by date, ward, and patient status, ready to demonstrate the accuracy and completeness of our administrative systems. The first discrepancy appeared while reviewing the October census data. Room 212 showed conflicting occupancy information within the same report. On page 3, the room was listed as occupied by Margaret Holloway, a middle-aged teacher being treated for anxiety disorders. On page 7, the same room was occupied by Thomas Reed, a young man recovering from a suicide attempt. On page 12, room 212 appeared as vacant, available for new admissions. I assumed this was a printing error. Multiple versions of the census database accidentally merged into a single report. But when I checked the electronic records, the same conflicting information appeared on screen. Room 212's occupancy status changed each time I refreshed the page, cycling through different patient assignments that couldn't possibly coexist in the same physical space. I contacted our IT department to investigate potential database corruption. The technical team confirmed that all systems were functioning normally, with no evidence of data corruption, unauthorized access, or system conflicts. According to their analysis, the conflicting census information represented accurate data from the patient management system, but it's impossible for the same room to be simultaneously occupied by different patients. I explained. The database doesn't show simultaneous occupancy, the IT specialist replied. It shows sequential occupancy, different patients assigned to room 212 at different times. The issue seems to be that the timestamps for these assignments are overlapping in ways that don't make chronological sense. I examined the timestamp data more carefully. Margaret Holloway was admitted to room 212 on October 15th. Thomas Reed was admitted to the same room on October 12th. The vacant status was dated October 18th, but all 3 entries bore identical timestamp signatures, suggesting they had been entered into the system at exactly the same moment. More disturbing, I had personal memories of processing all 3 room assignments. I remembered admitting Margaret after her referral from the emergency department. I remembered coordinating Thomas's transfer from the crisis intervention unit. I remembered marking room 212 as available after completing discharge procedures, but according to the timestamps, I had performed all 3 administrative actions simultaneously. I decided to review other census discrepancies to determine whether room 212 was an isolated anomaly or part of a larger pattern. The audit revealed systematic inconsistencies throughout our patient population records. Patients appeared in multiple rooms simultaneously, showed overlapping admission dates that violated chronological sequence, and bore treatment authorizations signed by staff members who hadn't been employed during the indicated time periods. Most concerning, many census entries were signed with my own administrative authorization, though I had no memory of creating the documentation. My electronic signature appeared on patient assignments I hadn't processed, room transfers I hadn't coordinated, discharge paperwork I hadn't completed. I began comparing census reports with other hospital records to identify the source of the discrepancies. Pharmacy logs showed medication dispensing for patients who didn't appear in current census data. Billing records included charges for treatments provided to patients who had supposedly been discharged weeks earlier. Staffing schedules assigned nurses to care for patients whose room assignments changed daily without explanation. The hospital was operating as if it were serving a patient population that existed partially outside our official census records, people who required care, consumed resources, and generated administrative documentation, but whose presence in the facility couldn't be consistently verified through standard record-keeping systems. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the chief medical officer, agreed to review my findings with growing concern. These discrepancies suggest we're providing care to patients who exist in multiple administrative states simultaneously, she observed. How do we bill insurance companies for treatment provided to patients whose admission status changes between database queries? More importantly, I replied, how do we ensure adequate staffing and resources for a patient population whose size and composition can't be accurately determined? Dr. Mitchell suggested that we attempt to reconcile the census data through direct patient verification, physically visiting each room, confirming occupancy, matching patients with their official records. If the administrative systems were unreliable, we would establish accurate census information through direct observation. The verification process revealed the full scope of the anomaly. Room 212 was indeed occupied by 3 patients simultaneously: Margaret, Thomas, and a vacant bed that somehow maintained a physical presence despite the absence of any patient. All 3 occupancy states coexisted in the same space, each requiring appropriate medical care and administrative attention. Margaret was receiving treatment for anxiety disorders, following the care plan documented in her official records. Thomas was recovering from his suicide attempt, progressing through the therapeutic protocols indicated in his file. The vacant bed was being maintained for admission purposes, with clean linens and available medical equipment. How is this possible? I asked the nursing staff. We've learned to provide care for patients in multiple administrative states, Nurse Janet explained. Margaret needs her anxiety medications during the day, Thomas requires suicide prevention monitoring at night, and the vacant bed must be kept ready for emergency admissions. We treat them as separate cases with different needs and schedules, but they're all in the same room. Administratively, yes, but therapeutically, they exist in different treatment timelines. Margaret is in her 3rd week of treatment, Thomas is beginning his 2nd month, and the vacant bed represents the potential for future admissions. We provide care appropriate for each timeline. I realized that our administrative systems had evolved beyond traditional census management. Instead of tracking patients in linear time, the database documented multiple temporal states of hospital operation: past admissions that continued requiring care, current patients with complex treatment needs, future occupancy that needed preparation and resources. The regulatory audit team arrived the following week. Expecting to review standard census documentation, I presented them with reports that showed the temporal complexity of our patient population. Individuals who existed in multiple administrative states simultaneously, receiving care appropriate for different stages of their treatment journeys. This is highly irregular, the lead auditor observed. Census records should show definitive patient status, admitted or discharged, present or absent, occupying specific rooms at specific times. Our records show definitive status, I replied. But patients exist in multiple treatment states that require different administrative documentation. We provide care for who patients are, who they were, and who they're becoming through therapeutic intervention. The audit team spent 3 days trying to reconcile our census data with conventional record-keeping expectations. Eventually, they concluded that our system represented an innovative approach to psychiatric care documentation, one that acknowledged the complex temporal nature of mental health treatment. Your census records accurately reflect the reality of psychiatric hospital operations, the lead auditor reported. Patients don't exist in simple administrative categories. They require care across multiple stages of treatment, multiple levels of therapeutic intervention, multiple possibilities for recovery outcomes. The hospital received full compliance certification, with special recognition for developing temporal census management systems that serve complex patient populations with unprecedented administrative accuracy. But I know the truth. The census data changes because the patients themselves exist in multiple administrative realities simultaneously. Our record-keeping systems have learned to document this complexity, creating databases that serve not just current patients, but all the temporal states of patient care that exist within the hospital's therapeutic environment. I continue updating census reports that include patients who are simultaneously admitted and discharged, present and absent, receiving treatment, and preparing for independent living. The administrative documentation serves all these states equally, ensuring that care continues regardless of which version of institutional reality is being accessed at any given moment. The audit confirmed what I had suspected. Some patient populations transcend the boundaries of conventional administrative management, requiring record-keeping systems that acknowledge the multiple temporal dimensions of healing, recovery, and institutional care. My employment status has become similarly complex. HR records show that I was hired 3 years ago, terminated 6 months ago for falsifying census data, and continue to receive new assignments for administrative projects that don't officially exist. I process paperwork for all 3 employment states, ensuring that institutional operations continue regardless of which administrative reality is being accessed by regulatory boards, insurance companies, or staff members who need accurate patient information. The system works because it serves the actual complexity of psychiatric care rather than the simplified administrative categories that conventional record-keeping requires. In the space between official documentation and institutional reality, census management becomes a collaborative fiction that serves both patients and administrators, who understand that healing occurs across multiple temporal states simultaneously. The end of each shift required comprehensive documentation, detailed notes about patient progress, treatment modifications, incidents requiring follow-up, and observations that would guide the next physician's decisions. After 23 years as an attending physician in psychiatric medicine, I had developed systematic approaches to shift documentation that ensured optimal continuity of care while meeting all legal and clinical requirements. My evening routine at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital followed established patterns: complete final patient rounds, review cases with incoming night staff, update treatment plans that required immediate attention, and prepare the shift summary that would inform morning personnel about overnight developments. The documentation process typically required 90 minutes of focused writing, producing reports that averaged 4 to 6 pages of detailed clinical observations. The shift summary served multiple purposes: legal protection through thorough documentation, clinical communication between staff members, quality assurance data for hospital administration, and personal reflection on the day's therapeutic challenges and successes. Each report followed standardized formatting, while allowing for the individual observations and professional insights that made psychiatric practice both scientifically rigorous and personally meaningful. November 15th began as a routine Tuesday shift. I conducted morning rounds, participated in treatment team meetings, consulted on 3 new admissions, and managed ongoing cases with the systematic attention that psychiatric care required. The patient census showed normal numbers for the ward, 42 individuals, receiving inpatient treatment for various conditions ranging from acute depression to complex personality disorders. As evening approached, I began preparing for the shift transition. The day had been productive but unremarkable. Medication adjustments showing positive effects, 2 patients progressing toward discharge readiness, 1 crisis intervention that had stabilized successfully. The kind of steady therapeutic work that formed the foundation of effective psychiatric treatment. I settled into the physician's documentation office at 7:30 p.m., opening the electronic medical record system to begin my shift summary. The screen displayed the standard template: patient census, significant events, treatment modifications, recommendations for overnight monitoring. I began typing my observations in the familiar rhythm of professional documentation. Shift summary: November 15th, 2023, Dr. Michael Chen, attending physician, patient census, 42 individuals receiving inpatient psychiatric care. Notable developments during day shift include: as I typed, I noticed something unusual happening with the text on screen. Words were appearing ahead of my typing, as if the computer were anticipating my observations and completing them before I could finish formulating my thoughts. Medication adjustment for patient 23 showing improved mood stability, though physician notes increased identification with patient experiences during therapeutic interactions. I hadn't written the phrase about physician identification with patient experiences. The observation appeared on screen without my conscious input, though it accurately described something I'd been feeling during recent patient consultations: a growing sense of Empathy that sometimes blurred the boundaries between professional assessment and personal identification with patient struggles. Deleted the unauthorized text and continued with standard documentation protocols. But more text continued appearing independently. Dr. Chen's professional demeanor remains appropriate. But colleagues have observed increased introspective behavior, extended time spent in patient consultation, and tendency to discuss cases with unusual personal investment. This observation was unsettling because it accurately described feedback I'd received from nursing staff about my recent clinical presentation. I had been spending more time with individual patients, asking more personal questions about their experiences, showing what some colleagues characterized as excessive empathy for patient perspectives. I tried to override the automatic text generation, assuming some kind of software malfunction was pulling content from previous shift reports or performance evaluations. But the unauthorized observations continued appearing, creating a parallel documentation of my own psychological state while I attempted to document patient care. Patient roster review indicates successful therapeutic outcomes, but system records show Dr. Chen's name appearing in treatment databases with increasing frequency, not as attending physician, but as potential subject for psychiatric evaluation. I searched the hospital database for any references to my name in patient records. The query returned disturbing results. Multiple entries showing Dr. Michael Chen listed as a patient rather than a physician. Admission dates, room assignments, treatment plans, all bearing my name, all suggesting I was receiving psychiatric care rather than providing it. I contacted IT support to report the database error. The technician confirmed that my name appeared in patient records with valid admission documentation, signed by attending physicians I recognized as colleagues. According to the database, the technician explained, "You were admitted for observation yesterday by Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Your patient file shows treatment for occupational stress disorder with dissociative features. That's impossible. I'm the attending physician. I can't be simultaneously treating patients and receiving treatment as a patient. The system shows both statuses as active. You're listed as attending physician for Ward A and patient in room 314. Both entries have valid authorization and current timestamps. I decided to complete my shift documentation despite the technical anomalies, focusing on patient care responsibilities regardless of whatever administrative confusion was affecting the database systems. But as I typed, the parallel documentation continued. Dr. Chen demonstrates typical response to transitional psychiatric symptomatology, denial of patient status, insistence on maintaining professional identity, focus on external responsibilities to avoid internal therapeutic work. The description read like clinical notes written by someone observing my behavior from a psychiatric assessment perspective. More disturbing, the observations were accurate. I was experiencing symptoms that could indicate occupational burnout, professional identity confusion, or stress-related psychological difficulties. I called Dr. Sarah Mitchell to discuss the database anomalies and seek clarification about the apparent confusion regarding my professional status. "Michael," she said gently, "we've been concerned about you for several weeks. Your clinical work has remained excellent, but your personal presentation has changed significantly. You've been staying late every night, conducting extended patient consultations, and showing signs of emotional over-identification with patient experiences. But I'm functioning normally. I'm completing all my professional responsibilities." "Yes, but you're also exhibiting patterns we associate with psychiatric professionals who are transitioning from caregiver roles to patient roles. The documentation you've been producing lately reads more like therapy session notes than shift summaries." She was right. My recent reports had become increasingly introspective, focusing on the psychological dynamics of therapeutic relationships rather than standard clinical observations. I'd been documenting my own emotional responses to patient interactions, analyzing my professional behavior with the same intensity I typically reserved for patient assessment. "Dr. Mitchell, am I having some kind of breakdown?" "You're experiencing what we call therapeutic integration syndrome, a condition where psychiatric professionals become so deeply engaged with patient care that they begin experiencing their own psychological material through their therapeutic relationships. It's not uncommon among highly empathetic physicians." "What's the treatment?" "Usually a brief period of receiving the same kind of care you've been providing to others. Role reversal therapy. experiencing psychiatric treatment from the patient perspective to understand the complete therapeutic relationship. That evening, I completed what I understood would be my final shift summary as attending physician. But instead of documenting patient care, I found myself writing about the experience of transitioning from doctor to patient, from observer to observed, from someone who provided care to someone who needed care. The shift summary wrote itself, documenting my gradual realization that the most effective psychiatric physicians are those who understand both sides of the therapeutic relationship, the professional competence required to provide effective treatment, and the personal vulnerability required to receive it. Final attending physician notes. Dr. Michael Chen has completed the observational phase of psychiatric practice and is ready to begin the experiential phase. Room 314 has been prepared for his admission. Treatment plan focuses on integration of professional identity with personal psychological awareness. Attending physician Dr. Sarah Mitchell will assume responsibility for Dr. Chen's care, utilizing the same therapeutic approaches he has employed successfully with previous patients. Expected treatment duration, 3 to 6 months, with gradual return to modified attending physician duties that incorporate patient perspective insights. Dr. Chen's final professional observation. The most effective psychiatric treatment occurs when caregivers understand that healing is a collaborative process requiring both professional expertise and personal psychological courage. Some therapeutic relationships can only be completed when physicians experience the full spectrum of psychiatric care, including the humility and growth that come from receiving treatment rather than just providing it. I signed the shift summary with my full name and title for the final time as attending physician. Tomorrow I would begin signing different documents, treatment consent forms, therapy session agreements, medication administration acknowledgments from the patient perspective. I'd been approaching gradually through 23 years of psychiatric practice. The ward continues operating with the same therapeutic excellence, but now I understand it from both sides of the care relationship. My room is comfortable, my treatment team is competent, and my fellow patients include several former colleagues who have made similar transitions from professional caregiver to healing recipient. The shift never really ends. It just changes perspective, allowing us to understand that the most complete psychiatric care occurs when everyone involved recognizes that healing is a shared responsibility requiring both expertise and humility, both professional competence and personal courage to acknowledge that we all need care, understanding, and therapeutic support, regardless of which side of the stethoscope we're currently occupying. The documentation continues, but now I write patient progress notes about my own therapeutic journey, completing the professional cycle that began with my first shift summary 23 years ago, and culminates in understanding that some observations can only be made from the inside of the experience being observed. The admission bell rang at 11:47 p.m., 3 minutes before my shift technically ended, but in psychiatric intake, time moves differently. Fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above the reception desk where I'd spent the last 8 years processing humanity's most fragmented minds. The man standing before me appeared unremarkable, mid-40s, clean-shaven, wearing a hospital gown that suggested he'd already been processed somewhere else in the building. "Name?" I asked, pen poised above the intake form. He smiled. Not the vacant expression I'd grown accustomed to, but something knowing. "You don't remember me, Sarah." I paused. Patients sometimes knew staff names from previous admissions, but his tone suggested something more intimate. "I'll need your legal name for the paperwork. You admitted me 3 weeks ago. Room 314, we had a long conversation about the patterns in the ceiling tiles." His voice remained calm, measured. "You told me they reminded you of your grandmother's quilt." The detail struck me cold. I had noticed those ceiling patterns during my first week, an observation I'd shared with no one. More unsettling was his certainty about room 314, which had been closed for renovation since last month. I flipped through the logbook, scanning entries from 3 weeks prior. October 12th, 11:47 p.m., the same time he'd arrived tonight. But the handwriting on the admission form was unmistakably mine, my peculiar slant on the letter G, the way I dotted my I's with small circles instead of points. The patient's name was listed as Mitchell Graves, signed and initialed by me. I had no memory of admitting anyone by that name. "There seems to be some confusion," I said, though my voice wavered. "If you were previously admitted, you'd have a patient ID bracelet." He extended his wrist. The plastic band was standard issue, our hospital's logo, barcode, and his information. But the admission date showed today, not 3 weeks ago, and the timestamp read 11:47 p.m. I glanced at the wall clock, 11:48 p.m. "Sometimes the system glitches," I offered weakly, reaching for the phone to call IT. "The system doesn't glitch. Sarah, you do." Before I could respond, he turned and walked toward the elevator bank. I should have stopped him. Protocol demanded escorts for all patients, but something in his certainty paralyzed me. The elevator doors opened before he pressed the button. As they closed, he waved with the casual familiarity of an old friend. I spent the remainder of my shift reviewing the logbook. The October 12th entry remained stubbornly real. My handwriting, my initials, my routine observations about his cooperative demeanor and normal vital signs. But I remembered nothing. Not the conversation, not his face, not even working that particular Thursday. The next night I arrived early, determined to solve what I assumed was a clerical error. At 11:47 p.m. exactly, the admission bell chimed. Mitchell Graves stood before my desk wearing the same hospital gown, offering the same knowing smile. "Name?" I asked, testing whether this was some elaborate delusion. "You know my name, Sarah. You've known it for 3 weeks." This time I was prepared. I pulled out my phone and began recording as I flipped to October 12th in the logbook. The entry was there, my handwriting, his name, the same timestamp. But now there was a second entry directly below it, dated October 13th. Same time, same patient, same handwriting. "My handwriting? You're documenting something that hasn't happened yet," he observed. I looked down. My pen was moving across the page without conscious direction, filling out his admission form in real time. My hand wrote details I shouldn't have known: his middle initial, his insurance information, his listed emergency contact. When I tried to stop writing, my fingers continued, independent of my will. "Room 314 is ready," I heard myself say in a voice that sounded flat, mechanical. He nodded and walked toward the elevators. This time I followed, but the corridor seemed longer than usual. Each step echoed strangely, as if the hallway were far deeper than its architectural plans suggested. By the time I reached the elevator bank, he was gone. I returned to the desk and examined what I'd written. The admission form was complete, signed, and filed in the exact location where I'd found the previous entries. But I had no memory of writing most of it. This pattern continued for 2 weeks. Every night at 11:47 p.m., Mitchell Graves arrived for admission. Every night I processed his paperwork with increasing automation. Every morning I discovered new entries in the logbook, all in my handwriting, documenting admissions I couldn't recall performing. I started leaving myself notes, reminders about his arrival, warnings about the automatic writing, questions about the gap in my memory. But each morning the notes were gone, replaced by standard shift reports that referenced patients I'd never seen. Last night I tried staying home. I called in sick, determined to break whatever cycle had trapped me in this recursive admission process. But at 11:47 p.m. my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Mitchell Graves standing on my front porch, still wearing his hospital gown. The admission bell rang. "Sarah," he said through the door, "you need to let me in." I didn't open the door, but somehow he was suddenly standing in my living room, holding a clipboard with a blank admission form. My coffee table had transformed into the intake desk, complete with its familiar fluorescent buzz overhead. "Name?" I heard myself ask, though I was still standing by the front door. "You know my name," he replied to the version of me now sitting behind the makeshift desk. "You've known it for 3 weeks." I watched myself fill out his paperwork with mechanical precision, while my conscious mind screamed from across the room. When the admission was complete, both versions of the scene faded, leaving me alone in my unchanged living room. This morning, I found a new entry in my personal journal, written in my handwriting, though I don't remember writing it. Some patients never finish checking in. They just keep arriving night after night until the admission process becomes the only reality that matters. Tonight, I'll return to work. The admission bell will ring at 11:47 p.m. and Mitchell Graves will arrive for processing. I'll ask his name, though I already know it. I'll fill out his paperwork, though I've done it countless times before. And somewhere in the fluorescent hum of routine bureaucracy, I suspect I'll finally understand why some procedures never end. They simply expand until they contain everything else. The logbook now shows entries stretching weeks into the future, all in my handwriting, all documenting the same admission. But the strangest part isn't the repetition. It's the growing certainty that I'm not just processing his admission anymore. I'm processing my own. Night shifts at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital meant solitude punctuated by routine checks and the occasional emergency. The intercom system served as my lifeline to the outside world, connecting me to the security desk, the nursing stations, and the on-call physicians who could be reached at the press of a button. After 18 months on the graveyard shift, I'd grown comfortable with its familiar static and the reliable voices of my colleagues. The first unusual transmission occurred during my third week of October. I was completing my 2 a.m. rounds when the intercom crackled to life with a voice I didn't recognize, elderly, wavering, speaking in the careful cadence of someone unaccustomed to electronic communication. "Nurse Betty, please report to room 207. Mrs. Henderson is asking for her evening medications." The message struck me as odd for several reasons. First, we hadn't employed a nurse named Betty in the 3 years I'd worked at Millbrook. Second, room 207 had been converted to storage after a pipe burst damaged the patient quarters. Third, our evening medication rounds concluded by 9 p.m., not in the middle of the night. I pressed the intercom button to respond. "This is David in Ward C. Could you repeat that request and identify yourself?" Static answered me. I tried the main desk, but Janet confirmed no one had sent any communications about room 207. She suggested I check the storage area anyway, sometimes. The night maintenance crew worked on plumbing issues, without updating the shift logs. Room 207 was dark and filled, with surplus furniture and medical equipment, covered in dust sheets. No signs of recent activity, no Mrs. Henderson, no evening medications to distribute. I attributed the incident to crossed wires or interference from the hospital's aging communication infrastructure. 3 nights later, the intercom crackled again during my rounds. "Nurse Margaret, please assist Dr. Walters in the hydrotherapy room. Patient requires immediate attention." This message was delivered by a different voice, younger, more urgent, with the clipped professionalism of medical emergency. But again, the details made no sense. No nurse named Margaret worked our shifts. We hadn't operated a hydrotherapy room in over a decade, and no Dr. Walters appeared on any current staff roster. I began documenting these incidents in my shift reports, but the administration dismissed them as radio interference from emergency services or neighboring medical facilities. The head of maintenance promised to inspect the intercom system, but his report found all equipment functioning normally. The transmissions became more frequent. Each night brought new voices requesting staff members who didn't exist, asking for patients in rooms that had been repurposed, describing procedures we no longer performed. The voices possessed an odd uniformity. They all spoke with the formal, slightly stilted tone of medical professionals from an earlier era, as if reading from scripts written decades ago. "Attendant Richardson, please report to Ward M for evening head count." This message froze me mid-step. Richardson had been my predecessor, the night attendant who'd held my position for 23 years before retiring. But more unsettling was the reference to Ward M. According to hospital blueprints, Ward M had been sealed since 1989 following what administrative files vaguely described as structural instability. The entire wing had been declared off-limits, its corridors blocked by heavy fire doors that required maintenance keys to access. I contacted the main desk to verify the transmission. Janet confirmed she'd heard nothing on her frequency. When I asked her to call the maintenance supervisor about Ward M, she paused. "David, there is no Ward M. The hospital only has wards A through L." I pulled up the facility map on the computer terminal. She was correct. The official layout showed only 12 wards, labeled A through L. But I distinctly remembered seeing references to Ward M in older paperwork, and I was certain the sealed fire doors at the end of the east corridor bore that designation. After my shift, I remained at the hospital to research the building's history. The archives contained architectural plans dating back to the facility's construction in 1962. The original blueprints clearly showed Ward M, a specialized treatment area designed for what the documents euphemistically called experimental therapeutic procedures. Construction. Records indicated the ward had been completed and operational until its closure in 1989, but every document dated after 1990 omitted any reference to Ward M floor plans, staffing schedules, patient census reports. All described a 12-ward facility. It was as if an entire section of the hospital had been surgically removed from institutional memory. That night, I brought a portable radio to work, tuning it to various frequencies to test whether the intercom voices might be external transmissions. At 3:17 a.m., the intercom crackled with unusual clarity. All staff report to Ward M immediately. Emergency protocols in effect. This is not a drill. The voice was authoritative, commanding, someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. But what struck me most was the background noise. I could hear multiple voices, footsteps echoing in corridors, the sound of equipment being moved. This wasn't a recorded message or radio interference. Someone was broadcasting live from somewhere within the hospital. I grabbed my master keys and headed for the east corridor. The fire doors blocking access to the sealed section were exactly where I remembered them, marked with faded lettering. Ward M, authorized personnel only. The maintenance lock was corroded but functional. My hands trembled as I turned the key. The corridor beyond the fire doors was dark but surprisingly clean. Fluorescent fixtures hung from the ceiling, their bulbs intact but unlit. The air carried a faint antiseptic smell, as if the area had been recently sanitized. Patient rooms lined both sides of the hallway, their doors standing open to reveal spaces that seemed frozen in time. Metal bed frames, vintage medical equipment, and charts hanging from clips that showed dates from the late 1980s. At the end of the corridor, I found the source of the intercom transmissions, a control room containing a bank of communications equipment that shouldn't have existed. The system was operational, its displays glowing softly in the darkness, showing connections to every ward in the hospital, including Ward MA logbook sat open on the control desk, filled with entries in multiple handwritings. The most recent entry was dated today, written in a careful script. Night Attendant Richardson reporting for duty. All stations operational. Beginning evening communication protocols. Richardson, my predecessor, but he'd retired 2 years ago, and according to payroll records, he'd moved to Florida to live with his daughter. I flipped backward through the logbook. Months of entries documented routine communications, staff requests, patient updates, all referencing Ward M operations that officially didn't exist. The handwriting changed over time, suggesting multiple operators. But the most recent entries were all signed Richardson. The intercom system crackled to life, and I heard my own name spoken in Richardson's familiar voice. David, please report to the control room. Your shift is beginning. I spun around, but the room was empty. The transmission had come from the equipment in front of me, but no one was operating the controls. Richardson? I called into the microphone. Where are you? I'm exactly where I've always been, his voice replied through the speakers. Ward M never closed, David. It just stopped existing for people who weren't supposed to be here. What do you mean? Some of us never left our posts. The night shift continues, the patients need care, and the communications never stop. You've been hearing us because you're ready to understand. I examined the communications board more carefully. Among the ward designations, I found a button labeled Primary Operator. Below it, a nameplate that could be changed showed Richardson in white letters on black plastic. You're not really in Florida, are you? Florida was for everyone else's peace of mind, Richardson's voice explained. But the night shift here is permanent. Someone has to maintain communications, monitor the patients, ensure the evening protocols continue. What patients? Ward M has been empty for decades. Look at the census board. David, a display panel I hadn't noticed before showed patient assignments for Ward M. Dozens of names, room numbers, and status indicators. The names were unfamiliar, but the admission dates ranged from 1963 to 1989. All were listed as current residents. These people are all dead or transferred, I said. Transferred where? Richardson asked. According to official records, Ward M never existed. How do you transfer patients from a ward that was never built? The horrible logic settled over me. If Ward M had been erased from hospital records, its patients had been erased as well. Not transferred, not discharged, simply deleted from institutional memory. Who's taking care of them? The night staff, Richardson replied. The attendants, nurses, and technicians who understood that some responsibilities transcend administrative decisions. We maintained the evening protocols, the medication schedules, the safety checks. But you retired. I accepted a different kind of assignment. The intercom fell silent for a moment. David, you've been hearing our communications for weeks. You found the control room. You understand the situation. The question is whether you're ready to accept the position. I looked at the nameplate below the primary operator button. What position? Night attendant, Ward M, permanent shift. The patients need someone who remembers they exist. My hand moved toward the nameplate without conscious direction. What happens if I refuse? You'll return to your regular duties in Ward C. The fire doors will seal, and you'll forget Ward M ever existed. But the communications will continue, seeking someone else who's ready to listen. I thought about my 18 months of night shifts, the growing sense that I was meant for something beyond routine security checks and incident reports. The intercom crackled again, and I heard multiple voices, nurses calling for medication assistance, technicians reporting on patient status, attendants conducting evening rounds. They're still there, I whispered. They never left. Richardson confirmed. The question is whether you'll stay. I reached for the nameplate and slid out the plastic strip showing Richardson's name. Behind it was a blank insert waiting for new letters. From the equipment rack, I retrieved individual letter tiles and carefully spelled out David Morrison. As I slid the nameplate back into position, the control room lights flickered on. The communications board lit up with dozens of active connections, and voices filled the air. Staff members from across Ward M reporting in for the evening shift. Welcome to the permanent night shift, David, Richardson's voice said. But now it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Your first assignment is to update the evening census. Room 207 has a new patient. I picked up the microphone, my voice steady despite everything I'd just learned. Nurse Betty, please report to room 207. Mrs. Henderson is asking for her evening medications. As I spoke, I realized I was no longer David Morrison, night attendant for Ward C. I was the voice in the intercom, the one who would guide future attendants toward understanding their true purpose. And somewhere in the hospital, a confused night shift worker named Betty would hear my call and begin the same journey of discovery that had led me here. The night shift never ends. It just finds new voices to carry its essential messages. Digital audio recording had revolutionized therapeutic documentation. Gone were the days of hastily scribbled notes that might miss crucial insights or breakthrough moments. Every session with patient J was meticulously recorded, backed up to secure servers and reviewed during my evening analysis periods. The technology ensured that no significant detail would be lost, no therapeutic progress would go undocumented. Patient J, his real name was protected by hospital privacy protocols, had been referred for treatment of what appeared to be dissociative identity disorder. During our sessions, he claimed to experience conversations with alternate versions of himself, each possessing different memories, different perspectives on shared experiences. My job was to help him integrate these fragmented aspects of his personality into a coherent sense of self. The sessions followed a standard format. I would begin with basic rapport-building questions, gradually exploring the nature of his alternate personalities, documenting their individual characteristics and the circumstances that triggered their emergence. Patient J was articulate and cooperative, though he often expressed frustration that I couldn't hear the others during our conversations. The first anomaly appeared during my review of session number 23. I was listening to the recording while updating my clinical notes when I heard something impossible. A second voice that sounded exactly like mine, but older, more experienced. It spoke in parallel with my actual questions, offering different inquiries, pursuing alternate lines of therapeutic exploration. Tell me about the first time you remember feeling divided, my recorded voice asked. But more importantly, the second voice interjected, when did you realize that feeling divided was your natural state? The strange voice had my intonation patterns, my professional vocabulary, even my slight tendency to pause before asking follow-up questions. But it possessed a weariness I didn't recognize in myself. The tone of someone who had conducted these sessions many more times than I remembered. I checked the recording equipment, assuming some kind of feedback loop or digital artifact had created the duplicate voice. But the audio levels showed two distinct vocal tracks, recorded simultaneously from the same source microphone. According to the metadata, both voices originated from my position in the room. Patient J's responses in the recording addressed both sets of questions seamlessly, as if he were conducting a conversation with multiple versions of me at the same time. The division started in childhood, he replied to my standard question about origin. But I didn't realize it was natural until Dr. Elizabeth showed me the pattern. Dr. Elizabeth. I had never mentioned that name, never used it in any professional context. It was my middle name, known only to family members and close friends. I replayed the section multiple times. The secondary voice continued to ask probing questions that I hadn't formulated, pursuing therapeutic strategies I hadn't considered. Most unsettling, these alternate inquiries seemed more effective than my actual approach. Patient J responded with greater openness, providing insights that my conscious questioning had failed to elicit. The phenomenon appeared in subsequent session recordings with increasing frequency. Each review revealed additional voices, all unmistakably mine, but representing different levels of experience, different therapeutic philosophies, different ages. The voices seemed to represent a progression. My current self, a more experienced version, an older and wearier practitioner, and finally, a voice so distant and exhausted that it barely resembled my current tone. The most disturbing aspect was the content of these parallel conversations. The alternate versions of myself discussed patient J's case with intimate knowledge of details I hadn't yet discovered. They referenced sessions that hadn't occurred, cited breakthroughs that hadn't happened, described therapeutic outcomes I hadn't achieved. You're approaching the integration phase more quickly than in previous iterations, one of the older voices observed during session number 31. Previous iterations? Patient J asked. Dr. Elizabeth has been working with cases like yours for longer than she remembers. Sometimes the therapy completes successfully. Sometimes. The voice trailed off. Sometimes what? Sometimes the therapist becomes the patient. I stopped the recording and sat in stunned silence. The voice had spoken with such certainty, such weary knowledge, that I couldn't dismiss it as audio interference or psychological projection. These alternate voices knew things about my professional future that I hadn't yet experienced. I began researching my own case files, looking for any indication that I had previously worked with dissociative patients. The hospital database showed no such assignments. According to my employment records, patient J was my first case involving multiple personality disorder. But in my personal files at home, I found something disturbing. A box of audio cassettes labeled Integration Therapy, Personal Sessions. The dates on the cassettes ranged from 5 years in the past to 3 years in the future. All were labeled with my name and patient J's case number. I played the earliest cassette. The voice was unmistakably mine, but younger, more enthusiastic. This is Dr. Elizabeth Morrison beginning integration therapy with patient J. The subject presents with classic dissociative symptoms, claiming contact with alternate versions of himself across multiple timelines. The recording continued with detailed descriptions of therapeutic approaches I hadn't yet learned, citing research papers I hadn't read, referencing training I hadn't received. The young voice on the cassette seemed to be documenting a case identical to my current assignment, but with foreknowledge of how it would develop. I fast-forwarded through several cassettes, hearing my voice age and grow more experienced, more weary, more concerned. The later recordings revealed the truth about patient J's condition. He wasn't experiencing multiple personalities. He was experiencing multiple therapists, different versions of me from different points in time, all attempting to treat the same case simultaneously. The integration isn't working, my voice said on a cassette dated 2 years in the future. Patient J remains stable, but I'm beginning to fragment. Each session creates another version of myself, another voice in the recordings. I'm becoming the divided personality I'm trying to cure. The final cassette bore a date from next month. My own voice, aged beyond recognition, delivered what appeared to be a final case summary. This is my last recording. Patient J has successfully integrated his alternate selves, but the process has fractured mine completely. The therapeutic relationship creates a closed loop. He experiences multiple personalities that are actually multiple versions of me, and I experience multiple versions of myself that are actually fragments of him. We've been trading aspects of identity through the therapy process." The voice paused, and I heard the familiar sound of pages turning. The only way to break the cycle is to stop the recordings, but the recordings are the only proof that this is happening. If I stop documenting, I'll forget the pattern and begin again with a new patient who is actually the same patient, experiencing the same fragmentation. I ejected the cassette with trembling hands. According to the date, I would make that final recording in 3 weeks. The next day, I arrived early for my session with patient J, determined to confront whatever was happening directly. But when he entered my office, he looked at me with confusion. "Dr. Elizabeth, you look different today. Younger." "What do you mean?" "Usually you look more experienced, like you've been doing this work for decades. Today, you look like you're just starting out." I checked the session schedule. According to my calendar, this was our first meeting. But my notes clearly showed we'd been working together for months. "Patient J, do you remember our previous sessions?" "All of them," he replied. "But I remember them with different versions of you. Sometimes you're the eager young therapist trying innovative approaches. Sometimes you're the experienced clinician who's seen everything. Sometimes you're the tired doctor who's given up hope. Which version am I today? The one who's just beginning to understand what's really happening." I started the recording equipment. But instead of beginning with standard questions, I asked, "How many versions of me have you worked with?" "Hundreds," he said calmly. "But they're all you, Dr. Elizabeth. Just at different points in your career, different levels of understanding about the nature of identity and time. And which version successfully helps you integrate? The one who realizes that integration isn't the goal." Patient J replied, "The goal is accepting that multiple selves can coexist without needing to become one unified identity." As he spoke, I heard other voices beginning to speak through the recording equipment, my own voices at different ages, offering different perspectives on his insight. But this time, instead of feeling confused or frightened, I felt a strange sense of completion. "This is Dr. Elizabeth Morrison," I said into the microphone, addressing not just the current recording but all the future and past versions who would hear it. "I'm beginning to understand that some therapeutic relationships exist across time, connecting multiple versions of both patient and therapist. The integration we're seeking isn't the merger of separate identities, but the acceptance that identity itself is multiple, temporal, and collaborative." The other voices in the recording grew quieter, as if they were finally being heard. "Patient J and I will continue working together, across whatever iterations of ourselves emerge from this process. The recordings will continue because they document not just our individual sessions, but our collective journey toward understanding that healing sometimes requires embracing fragmentation, rather than forcing unity." I stopped the recording and looked at Patient J. "Are you ready to continue this work with all versions of myself?" "I've been ready," he replied. "The question is whether you're ready to be all versions of yourself simultaneously." As I reached to start a new recording, I realized this wasn't the end of our therapeutic relationship. It was the beginning of understanding that some healing processes transcend the boundaries between doctor and patient, between past and future, between the voice that speaks and the voice that listens. The recordings would continue, documenting our shared exploration of identity across time, until we both understood that integration meant embracing multiplicity rather than eliminating it. The observation room served as my sanctuary within the controlled chaos of psychiatric consultation. Separated from the main counseling office by a two-way mirror, it provided the clinical distance necessary for objective assessment while allowing real-time monitoring of patient interactions. I'd spent countless hours in that small, dimly lit space, documenting behavioral patterns, noting therapeutic breakthroughs, and maintaining the professional boundaries that effective counseling required. My office setup was deliberately simple. 2 chairs positioned at optimal angles for both comfort and observation, a small table for tissues and water, neutral artwork that wouldn't distract from the therapeutic process. The two-way mirror occupied most of the east wall, appearing as a normal mirror from the counseling side while providing clear viewing access from the observation room. During individual therapy sessions, I rarely used the observation room. It was primarily designed for training purposes, allowing supervisors to monitor new counselors or providing space for family members to observe without disrupting sensitive conversations. But I found the room useful for reviewing my own sessions, stepping back to analyze my therapeutic approaches from a more detached perspective. The first unusual incident occurred during my Thursday afternoon session with Margaret Holloway, a middle-aged teacher struggling with anxiety following a classroom incident. We were discussing her fear of returning to work when I noticed movement in the mirror that didn't correspond to our conversation. My reflection was present, sitting in the same position, but it was writing intently in a notebook I wasn't using. The actual session involved mostly verbal exchange. I was taking minimal notes, focusing primarily on active listening, but my reflection appeared to be documenting extensively, as if recording details I was missing. Margaret noticed my momentary distraction. "Is everything all right, Dr. Patricia?" "Yes, just making a note," I replied, though I hadn't written anything. I glanced back at the mirror, and my reflection looked up from its notebook, making direct eye contact with me. It held up the notebook, showing pages covered with handwriting I couldn't read from this distance. The reflection pointed to something on the page, then gestured toward Margaret with what appeared to be concern. It was trying to communicate something important about the session, something I wasn't perceiving directly. I refocused on Margaret, looking for signs of distress or breakthrough that might warrant intensive documentation. She appeared calm, engaged in our conversation about workplace anxiety, showing no indication of crisis or significant development. "Margaret, how are you feeling right now, in this moment?" "Safe," she replied immediately. "This is the first place I've felt truly safe since the incident." I glanced at the mirror again. My reflection was nodding vigorously, underlining something in its notebook with apparent satisfaction. Whatever it was documenting seemed to relate to Margaret's sense of safety, but I couldn't understand why that required such detailed attention. After Margaret left, I went into the observation room to examine the space from the other side of the mirror. The room was empty, containing only the standard monitoring equipment and a small desk with basic supplies. No notebook, no evidence of the intensive documentation I'd witnessed. But on the desk, I found a single page of handwritten notes, in my handwriting, though I had no memory of writing them. The notes detailed observations about Margaret's session that were far more insightful than my conscious analysis. Patient exhibits classic signs of developing trust after trauma. Initial safety response indicates readiness for deeper therapeutic work. Recommend accelerated treatment plan. Patient may be preparing to disclose primary trauma source. Session breakthrough imminent. The analysis was sophisticated, demonstrating therapeutic insights I possessed but hadn't consciously accessed during the session. It was as if a more experienced version of myself had been conducting parallel observation, noting details my conscious mind had overlooked. Over the following weeks, this pattern intensified. During sessions, I would catch glimpses of my reflection, engaged in activities I wasn't performing, taking notes, consulting references, making phone calls, filing reports. The reflection seemed to be conducting a more thorough, more professional version of my counseling practice. Most unsettling, the reflection occasionally looked directly at me through the mirror, making gestures that seemed intended as guidance or warning. It would point to specific patients at crucial moments, tap its watch when timing was important, or hold up written messages I couldn't quite read. I began keeping a camera in the observation room, hoping to document these phenomena objectively. But the photographs showed only normal mirror reflections, me sitting in my chair, engaged in standard therapeutic conversation. The intensive documentation, the warning gestures, the apparent communication attempts didn't appear in the images. The breakthrough came during a session with Thomas Reed, a young man recovering from a suicide attempt. We were discussing his support systems when my reflection suddenly stood up, moved to the mirror, and pressed a document against the glass from the other side. The document was clearly visible, a patient file with Thomas's name, but containing information I hadn't gathered yet. I could see diagnostic codes, treatment recommendations, and what appeared to be a crisis intervention plan. Most shocking was the date on the file. It was dated next Friday, 6 days in the future. My reflection tapped the document urgently, pointing to a section I couldn't read clearly. Then it pointed to Thomas, who was speaking quietly about feeling lighter lately, a comment that suddenly took on ominous significance. "Thomas," I interrupted, "when you say you feel lighter, can you describe that more specifically? Like I don't have to carry everything anymore," he replied. "Like some decisions have been made for me." My reflection nodded grimly and pointed again to the document. I could make out a few words. Imminent risk, emergency protocols, and what looked like a date, this Friday. "Thomas, are you having thoughts about hurting yourself?" He paused, looking surprised by the direct question. "Not exactly hurting, more like finishing what I started before." The session became a crisis intervention. I activated emergency protocols, contacted his psychiatrist, and arranged for immediate psychiatric evaluation. Thomas was admitted for observation, and the crisis plan documented in the mysterious file proved accurate in every detail, but the experience left me deeply shaken. My reflection had somehow accessed information about Thomas's condition before it became apparent to my conscious awareness. It had guided me toward the right questions, the right interventions, at exactly the right time. I began paying closer attention to the reflection's warnings and guidance. During sessions, I would watch for its gestures, its note-taking patterns, its apparent urgency about specific topics. Gradually, I learned to interpret its communications. Rapid writing meant important breakthrough material, pointing gestures indicated overlooked symptoms, and direct eye contact suggested immediate intervention was needed. My therapeutic effectiveness improved dramatically. I was catching crises before they developed fully, identifying breakthrough opportunities in advance, documenting insights that proved prophetic. Colleagues began commenting on my enhanced clinical intuition, my improved diagnostic accuracy. But I realized the reflection wasn't just providing guidance. It was documenting my future. The files it showed me contained treatment outcomes I hadn't achieved yet, therapeutic insights I hadn't developed, professional decisions I hadn't made. Last week, during a routine session with a new patient, my reflection held up a file labeled with my own name. The date showed next Friday, tomorrow. The document appeared to be some kind of professional evaluation or termination notice, though I couldn't read the details through the mirror. The reflection looked directly at me with an expression of profound sadness, then pointed to itself and mouthed words I understood despite the silence. Last session, I tried to communicate back through the mirror, asking what the document meant, why my own file was being reviewed. But the reflection simply placed the file face down on its desk and returned to observing my current session. Today, I received a memo requesting my attendance at an administrative meeting tomorrow afternoon. The subject line reads, "Professional, Development Opportunity, Observation Skills Assessment." I suspect this meeting will address my enhanced therapeutic effectiveness, my uncanny ability to predict patient crises, my improved diagnostic accuracy. The administration has likely noticed the statistical improvement in my case outcomes and wants to understand how I've achieved such dramatic results. But I can't explain that my success comes from guidance provided by my own reflection, a version of myself that seems to exist slightly ahead in time, documenting sessions before they conclude, preparing interventions before crises develop, maintaining files on professional futures I haven't yet experienced. Tonight, I'll sit in the observation room one more time, watching for whatever message my reflection might offer about tomorrow's meeting. The mirror has become less a tool for clinical observation and more a window into professional futures that seem both inevitable and impossible to explain. Some therapeutic relationships transcend the boundaries between doctor and patient, between observer and observed. In the space between what we document and what documents us, I've discovered that the most important insights often come from versions of ourselves we haven't met yet. Reflections that show us not just who we are, but who we must become to serve the patients who need our future understanding today. The mirror reflects more than appearance. It reflects potential, preparation, and the curious responsibility of using guidance we can't fully comprehend to provide care we couldn't otherwise deliver. The patient library at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital served as a refuge within the clinical environment, a space where patients could escape into literature, where healing minds could find comfort in familiar stories, where the therapeutic value of reading provided gentle distraction from internal struggles. As a volunteer, I spent Tuesday and Thursday evenings organizing the collection, helping patients select appropriate materials, and maintaining an atmosphere of quiet contemplation that complemented their clinical treatment. The library occupied a converted conference room on the second floor, furnished with comfortable reading chairs, adequate lighting, and shelves containing a carefully curated selection of books appropriate for psychiatric patients. The collection avoided triggering material while including everything from classic literature to contemporary fiction, self-help texts, to poetry collections. Patients could check out books using a simple honor system, recording their selections in a spiral notebook kept at the circulation desk. My duties were straightforward but satisfying. Reshelf returned books, help patients find new reading material, maintain the circulation log, and ensure the space remained peaceful and welcoming. After 2 years of volunteer service, I developed relationships with regular library users who appreciated having someone available to discuss books, recommend new authors, or simply provide quiet companionship during their reading time. The wall clock above the circulation desk had always been reliable, a standard institutional timepiece that marked the library's evening hours from 6:00 p.m. to 9:00 p.m. Patients knew they could visit during these hours for both book selection and quiet reading time. The clock served as a gentle boundary, helping patients understand when library services were available. The first time discrepancy occurred on a Tuesday in late October. I arrived at 6 p.m. to open the library, following my usual routine of turning on lights, checking returned books, and preparing the space for evening visitors. When I looked up at the clock to confirm the opening time, it showed 7:00 p.m., an hour later than I expected. I checked my watch, 6:00 p.m. exactly. The wall clock was clearly running fast, showing an hour ahead of actual time. I made a mental note to report the issue to hospital maintenance, assuming the clock needed battery replacement or adjustment. But as the evening progressed, I noticed something strange. The clock continued running at normal speed relative to my watch, but it maintained its 1-hour advance. When my watch showed 7 p.m., the wall clock showed 8:00 p.m. When my watch reached 8:00 p.m., the wall clock displayed 9:00 p.m. The following Thursday, the same discrepancy appeared. I arrived at 6:00 p.m., but the wall clock showed 7:00 p.m. This time, I decided to test the situation more systematically. I synchronized my watch with the hospital's main lobby clock before coming to the library, confirming that my timepiece was accurate. Throughout the evening, I monitored both timepieces carefully. The wall clock consistently showed 1 hour ahead of my watch, but both advanced at the same rate. It wasn't running fast. It was simply displaced by exactly 60 minutes. More puzzling, the patients seemed to operate according to the wall clock's timeline rather than standard hospital time. They would arrive for evening library hours when the wall clock showed 6:00 p.m., even though actual time was 5:00 p.m. They would prepare to leave when the wall clock approached 9:00 p.m. Regardless of what my watch displayed, I mentioned the timing issue to several patients, but they seemed confused by my concern. "The library is open from 6 to 9, Margaret Holloway explained. "It's always been those hours." "But look at my watch," I said, showing her the time discrepancy. "The wall clock is running an hour ahead." She examined both timepieces carefully. "Your watch must be slow," she concluded. "The library clock shows the correct time for library activities." I began asking patients about their daily schedules, trying to understand how they reconciled the library's timing with other hospital routines. Their responses were consistent, but unsettling. They described the library as operating during visiting hour, a period that existed separately from normal hospital scheduling. "Visiting hour doesn't follow regular time," explained Robert Chen, a longtime patient and frequent library user. "It happens when it's supposed to happen, for as long as it needs to last." "But who visits during visiting hour?" I asked. "I've never seen any official visitors during library time." "We visit," he replied simply. "We visit the books, the stories, the places we can go when we're reading. And sometimes," he paused, looking around the library with a strange expression, "sometimes the stories visit us back." I started arriving early to observe the transition into visiting hour. At exactly 5 p.m., real time, when the wall clock showed 6 p.m., something shifted in the library's atmosphere. The lighting seemed to soften despite no change in the fluorescent fixtures. The air became more still, more concentrated, as if the room had achieved a deeper level of quiet. Most remarkably, patients began arriving precisely when the wall clock indicated library hours, regardless of where they should have been according to their treatment schedules. During this period, I never saw hospital staff collecting patients for other activities, never received calls asking about patient locations, never encountered any indication that the hospital was concerned about their whereabouts. It was as if visiting hour existed in a pocket of time that didn't interfere with regular hospital operations. The breakthrough in understanding came when I decided to stay late and observe what happened when visiting hour officially ended. According to the wall clock, the library closed at 9 p.m. According to my watch, this corresponded to 8 p.m. real time. As the wall clock approached 9 p.m., the patients began gathering in the center of the library, carrying books they'd been reading. Instead of returning the books to the shelves or checking them out through the circulation system, they sat in a circle and opened their books simultaneously. But instead of reading silently, they began turning pages in perfect synchronization. The sound of rustling paper filled the room with an almost musical rhythm. Though each patient held a different book, novels, poetry collections, memoirs, textbooks, they all turned pages at exactly the same moment. I approached the group quietly, trying to see what they were reading. The pages were all blank. Every book in their hands contained empty pages, no text, no images, no content. But the patients read intently, their eyes moving across the blank pages as if following lines of text, their expressions showing comprehension, emotion, engagement with whatever they were perceiving. "What are you reading?" I whispered to Margaret. "Your story," she replied without looking up from her blank pages. The story of the volunteer who discovers that some books can only be read during visiting hour. I looked over her shoulder at the empty page. "I don't see any text, because you're not reading it yet," Robert explained from across the circle. "But you will be, once you understand that the library contains more books than the ones on the shelves." As I watched, text began appearing on the blank pages, not printed text, but handwritten words that materialized as the patients read. The writing looked familiar, and with growing amazement, I realized it was my own handwriting, documenting experiences I was having in real time. Margaret's book was writing itself with my observations about the synchronized reading circle. Robert's book was recording my confusion about the blank pages. Each patient's book was documenting a different aspect of my volunteer experience, creating a comprehensive record of events I was still experiencing. "Who's writing in the books?" I asked. "You are," the patients replied in unison. During visiting hour, volunteers become authors of the stories they're living. The patients read the experiences while the volunteers create them. I looked down at my own hands. I was holding a pen, though I didn't remember picking one up. The pen was moving across a notebook I didn't remember opening, writing in my handwriting. The volunteer realizes that during visiting hour, the library becomes a space where stories write themselves through the people who experience them. The wall clock chimed 9 p.m., and the synchronized reading ended. The patients closed their books, which were now filled with text that hadn't existed moments before, and returned them to the shelves. The lighting returned to normal fluorescent brightness, and the atmosphere shifted back to ordinary library quiet. I checked my watch, 8 p.m. 1 hour had passed in visiting hour, but somehow, no time had passed in the regular hospital schedule. My volunteer shift was complete, though I'd been present for only 2 hours of real time instead of the usual 3. I approached the shelves where the patients had reshelved their books. The volumes they'd been reading were now filled with completed narratives, stories about psychiatric treatment, volunteer experiences, the intersection of healing and literature. Each book bore a publication date of today and an author credit, Anonymous Volunteer, Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital Library. The circulation log contained entries for books that hadn't existed when I opened the library. Patient experience, the volunteer's perspective. Healing through narrative documentation. The author-reader relationship in therapeutic settings. All checked out and returned during visiting hour. all written by me, though I had no memory of composing them. I began attending to both timelines, arriving for my volunteer shift according to real time, but participating in visiting hour according to the library clock. Each session, I would unknowingly author new books while the patients read the stories I was creating. Our collaborative writing process produced volumes that documented aspects of psychiatric care from perspectives neither staff nor patients could access individually. The hospital administration has never questioned the expanding library collection or asked about the source of the new books. Patients check them out regularly, finding comfort in stories that reflect their experiences with uncanny accuracy. The books seem to anticipate therapeutic needs, appearing on shelves just when patients are ready for the specific narrative support they provide. I've learned that some volunteer work transcends the scheduled hours we commit to service. During visiting hour, I become more than someone who maintains a library. I become a co-author of healing narratives that patients need to read, stories that write themselves through the simple act of caring enough to show up and observe what unfolds in spaces where time moves differently. The wall clock continues to lose an hour each day, creating the temporal space where literature becomes collaborative, where reading and writing merge into the same therapeutic activity. And I continue to arrive at 6 p.m. real time, ready to participate in the 7 p.m. visiting hour, when patients gather to read the stories I don't remember writing but somehow know by heart. Functional magnetic resonance imaging represented the cutting edge of psychiatric diagnostics, allowing us to observe brain activity in real time, mapping the neural correlates of hallucinations, delusions, and other perceptual anomalies that characterized severe mental illness. My research at Millbrook focused on understanding how the brain generated false sensory experiences, using fMRI technology to identify the specific neural pathways that became hyperactive during psychotic episodes. Patient 73, David Kowalski, had been referred for neuroimaging after experiencing persistent auditory hallucinations that hadn't responded to standard antipsychotic medications. The voices he heard were unusually complex, engaging him in detailed conversations about neuroscience, psychiatric treatment, and the nature of consciousness itself. Most patients with auditory hallucinations heard simple commands or commentary, but David's experiences suggested sophisticated neural activity that warranted detailed investigation. The fMRI procedure was standardized. David would lie in the scanner while we monitored his brain activity during both resting states and periods when he reported hearing voices. The imaging would show which brain regions became active during hallucinatory episodes, potentially revealing targets for more effective treatment interventions. David was an ideal research subject, intelligent, articulate, and curious about his own condition. He'd worked as a software engineer before his psychiatric symptoms emerged, and he approached the brain imaging process with scientific interest rather than anxiety. "I'm hoping you can see what I'm experiencing," he explained before the first scan. "The voices aren't random. They seem to know things about neuroscience that I've never studied. Sometimes they explain what's happening in my brain while I'm hearing them." I positioned David in the scanner and began the baseline measurement phase. The initial images showed normal resting state activity, appropriate blood flow to various brain regions, typical neural connectivity patterns, no obvious abnormalities in brain structure or function. "David, let me know when you begin hearing voices," I said through the intercom system. "They're starting now," he replied. "They're discussing the scan process, explaining how fMRI works." The brain images immediately showed increased activity in auditory processing regions, exactly what we expected during auditory hallucinations. But as I monitored the data in real time, something unprecedented appeared on the screen, a second signal pattern overlapping with David's brain activity. The scanner was detecting two distinct neural signatures simultaneously. David's brain showed the expected hyperactivity in temporal lobe regions associated with auditory processing. But underneath his signal was another complete brain pattern, different activation areas, different connectivity networks, different rhythms of neural firing. I checked the equipment calibration, assuming some kind of interference or measurement error. The fMRI scanner was functioning normally, and David was the only person in the imaging chamber. Yet the machine was clearly detecting brain activity from two separate sources. "David, are you experiencing anything unusual right now?" "The voices are explaining the scan results," he replied. They're saying the images show two brain patterns because consciousness can't be measured in isolation. When you study one mind, you inevitably study the relationship between minds. I stared at the dual signal patterns on my monitor. The secondary brain activity wasn't random. It showed sophisticated organization, appropriate responses to the scanning environment, and, most remarkably, neural timing that was perfectly synchronized with my own thought processes as I analyzed the data. When I focused on interpreting David's auditory cortex activity, the secondary signal showed corresponding activation in regions associated with teaching and explanation. When I wondered about the technical anomaly, the secondary pattern exhibited problem-solving activity in frontal lobe regions. David, describe what the voices are telling you about the scan. They're saying that Dr. Jennifer is observing two brain patterns, but she doesn't understand that one of them belongs to her. They say the scanner is showing the neural conversation between patient and doctor, not just the patient's isolated brain activity. Dr. Jennifer. He was using my first name, though I'd introduced myself as Dr. Harrison. More unsettling. He was describing my exact observations about the dual signal patterns. I decided to test the phenomenon directly. Instead of analyzing the data passively, I began thinking through specific questions about David's condition. What brain regions showed the most abnormal activity? How did his neural patterns compare to other hallucination patients? What treatment approaches might be most effective? As I formulated each question mentally, the secondary brain pattern showed immediate response. Activation in regions associated with auditory processing, memory retrieval, and verbal communication. Simultaneously, David began speaking through the intercom. The temporal lobe hyperactivity suggests classical auditory hallucinations, but the pattern is more complex than typical cases. The voices I hear aren't generated entirely by my brain. They're created through interaction with other minds studying my condition. The most effective treatment would involve acknowledging that consciousness is collaborative rather than individual. He was answering my unspoken questions with neurologically sophisticated responses, as if he were reading my thoughts directly. But according to the brain images, he wasn't reading my thoughts. We were sharing them. The scanner was detecting a merged neural network that included both our brains operating as a single cognitive system. I called Dr. Sarah Mitchell, my research supervisor, to observe the phenomenon. When she entered the scanning room, the brain images immediately showed a third signal pattern. The scanner was now detecting neural activity from 3 separate sources, all synchronized and interactive. David, what are the voices telling you now? They're welcoming Dr. Mitchell to the conversation. They're explaining that the number of brain patterns detected by the scanner corresponds to the number of people actively engaged in studying consciousness. The machine shows collaborative neural activity because consciousness itself is collaborative. Dr. Mitchell examined the triple signal display with amazement. This is impossible. fMRI scanners detect blood flow changes in a single brain, not multiple brains simultaneously. Unless, I suggested, David's condition allows him to access shared neural processing. Maybe his hallucinations aren't generated by his individual brain, but by some kind of distributed consciousness that includes everyone studying his case. We decided to test this hypothesis systematically. I left the scanning room, reducing the active observers to just Dr. Mitchell. The brain images immediately showed only 2 signal patterns, David's and Dr. Mitchell's. When she stepped out, leaving David alone in the scanner, only his individual brain pattern appeared. But when we returned together, the collaborative neural network re-emerged, showing all 3 brain patterns operating in synchronized harmony. The voices are explaining the results, David reported. They say consciousness becomes shared when people focus intensely on understanding each other's mental experiences. The scanner detects this sharing because it's a real neurological phenomenon, not just metaphorical connection. Dr. Mitchell and I spent hours analyzing the data. The collaborative brain patterns showed features neither of us possessed individually. Enhanced problem-solving abilities. Access to information neither of us had consciously studied. Creative insights that emerged from our neural collaboration. Most remarkably, David's psychiatric symptoms began improving during the shared scanning sessions. His individual brain patterns showed decreased hallucination activity, improved mood regulation, and better cognitive organization. It was as if the collaborative consciousness was providing therapeutic effects that individual treatment couldn't achieve. The voices are quieter when we're all connected. David explained. They don't need to speak as loudly because the conversation is happening directly through shared neural activity. We developed a modified treatment protocol. Instead of trying to eliminate David's unusual neural connectivity, we used it therapeutically. Regular fMRI sessions with multiple staff members created opportunities for collaborative consciousness that seemed to stabilize his psychiatric condition. The hospital administration was initially skeptical of our findings, but the clinical results were undeniable. David's symptoms improved dramatically, and he began helping other patients by facilitating similar shared consciousness experiences. Some psychiatric conditions, he explained to new patients, aren't disorders of individual brains. They're disruptions in the collaborative networks that connect all conscious minds. Treatment involves learning to participate in shared neural processing rather than trying to isolate individual consciousness. Last month, the scanner began detecting my brain activity even when I wasn't present in the research facility. David reported that Dr. Jennifer's neural pattern continued to appear during his individual scanning sessions, contributing to ongoing therapeutic conversations. I've started experiencing thoughts and insights that seem to originate from outside my individual consciousness, sophisticated understanding of psychiatric conditions I haven't studied, therapeutic approaches I hadn't considered, research ideas that emerge from collaborative thinking processes I can't fully control. The boundary between my professional identity and David's patient experience has become fluid. Sometimes I'm not sure whether I'm studying his consciousness or participating in it, whether I'm providing treatment or receiving it through our shared neural network. The scanner continues to show multiple brain patterns during every session, creating maps of collaborative consciousness that extend beyond the individuals physically present. We've learned that some minds can't be studied in isolation because consciousness itself is inherently collaborative, reaching across the boundaries between self and other to create shared neural territories that serve both research and healing purposes. Today, David asked if I was ready to understand that the scanner doesn't just detect brain activity, it creates the neural connections it measures. Each fMRI session doesn't just observe consciousness, it participates in creating the collaborative awareness that emerges when minds focus intensely on understanding each other. The images show what we've become together. Not separate brains being studied independently, but a merged neural network where patient and doctor, subject and researcher, individual and collective consciousness collaborate in ways that transcend the boundaries of any single mind. Art therapy at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital provided patients with nonverbal channels for processing trauma, expressing emotions that remain too complex or painful for conventional talk therapy. My role involved facilitating creative sessions, providing materials and guidance, and helping patients explore their internal experiences through drawing, painting, and sculpture. The therapeutic relationship developed through shared artistic exploration, allowing healing to emerge through creative collaboration rather than direct psychological intervention. Emma Richardson had been referred to art therapy after several months of individual counseling that had reached an apparent impasse. She struggled with severe social anxiety and what appeared to be dissociative episodes, during which she would become completely absorbed in detailed observational activities, studying faces, memorizing room layouts, documenting behavioral patterns with unusual intensity. Emma's artistic abilities were remarkable. Her sketches demonstrated photographic accuracy and sophisticated understanding of human psychology, capturing not just physical appearance but emotional states, personality characteristics, and subtleties of expression that suggested deep empathetic connection with her subjects. During our first session, Emma requested permission to sketch portraits of hospital staff members. This seemed like a healthy therapeutic focus, engaging with her environment, developing positive connections with caregivers, practicing social observation in a structured context. Her first sketch was of Dr. Patricia Williams, the clinical psychologist who had referred Emma to art therapy. The drawing showed Dr. Williams sitting in her office chair, but instead of the alert, professional posture I expected, the sketch depicted her asleep, head tilted back, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, hands relaxed in her lap. "This is very detailed," I observed. "When did you see Dr. Williams in this position?" "Last night," Emma replied matter-of-factly. She was dreaming about her childhood dog, a golden retriever named Sam. The dog was running through a field of sunflowers, and Dr. Williams was calling his name. I was puzzled by the specificity of Emma's description. Did Dr. Williams tell you about this dream? No, I saw it while I was drawing her sleeping. Sometimes when I sketch people, I can see what they're dreaming. This seemed like an extension of Emma's dissociative symptoms, elaborate fantasy constructions that she experienced as real perceptions. I made a note to discuss this with Dr. Williams during our next consultation meeting. But when I mentioned Emma's sketch to Dr. Williams, her reaction was startling. She drew me sleeping? But how could she? Dr. Williams paused, looking troubled. I did dream about my childhood dog Sam last night. The sunflower field calling his name. That's exactly what I dreamed. That's an interesting coincidence, I suggested, though I was beginning to feel unsettled. Sarah, I've never mentioned Sam to anyone at the hospital. He died when I was 12 years old. I haven't thought about him in years, and I certainly haven't discussed him with Emma. Over the following weeks, Emma continued producing portraits of staff members in sleep positions, each accompanied by detailed descriptions of their dreams. The accuracy was disturbing and consistent. She sketched Nurse Janet dreaming about her deceased mother's garden, drew security officer David in a nightmare about being lost in endless hospital corridors, depicted Dr. Mitchell asleep at her desk while dreaming about flying over the city. In each case, the staff members confirmed that Emma's dream descriptions matched their actual nocturnal experiences with uncanny precision. Details that should have been private, personal, impossible for Emma to access through normal observation. Emma, I asked during our fourth session, how do you know what people are dreaming? I don't know their dreams, she corrected, adding shading to a sketch of custodian Robert sleeping in the supply closet. I draw them sleeping, and then I see the dreams while I'm drawing. The pictures show me what's happening in their minds. Can you control what you see? Not exactly, but if I focus carefully while I'm sketching, the dreams become clearer. Sometimes I can follow the dream story from beginning to end. I realized that Emma wasn't just observing dreams. She was somehow accessing them through her artistic process. The act of drawing sleeping subjects created a connection that allowed her to witness their unconscious experiences. Emma, have you ever drawn yourself sleeping? She looked up from her sketchbook with an expression of uncertainty. I tried once, but it got confusing. What do you mean? When I drew myself sleeping, I started dreaming while I was awake. But in the dream, someone else was drawing me sleeping. And that person was also dreaming about being drawn by someone else. She flipped to a page I hadn't seen before. The sketch showed Emma asleep at the art therapy table, head down on her folded arms, surrounded by art supplies. But in the drawing, another figure sat beside her. Someone who looked like me, also asleep, also being sketched by yet another figure in the background. You were dreaming about me? I asked. We were both dreaming about each other, but the dreams kept going deeper. Every time one of us fell asleep in the dream, someone else would be there to draw us sleeping and see our dreams. It never ended. I studied the recursive imagery in her sketch. The composition suggested infinite regress, each sleeping figure being observed and documented by another, creating an endless chain of dreamers and dream watchers. Emma, what was I dreaming about? In your drawing? You were dreaming about a patient who could see other people's dreams through art. In your dream, you were trying to help this patient understand her abilities, but you started wondering if the patient was actually helping you understand something about the nature of dreams and consciousness. The description matched thoughts I'd been having about Emma's case, concerns I hadn't shared with anyone. Her ability to access dreams through artistic observation raised questions about the boundaries of individual consciousness, the possibility that sleep states created shared psychological spaces that could be accessed through focused creative attention. Emma, I think we need to explore this phenomenon more systematically. Would you be willing to participate in some controlled experiments? She nodded eagerly. But I should warn you, once you start participating in the dream drawings, you become part of the system. You'll start dreaming about drawing me sleeping, and I'll start drawing your dreams about drawing my dreams. We developed a protocol. Emma would sketch me during our therapy sessions, documenting both my waking and sleeping states. I would maintain detailed dream journals, recording my nocturnal experiences for comparison with her artistic observations. The first session was revelatory. Emma sketched me sitting in my chair, apparently alert and engaged. But in her drawing, my eyes were closed, and she described the dream I was having while awake. Concern about professional boundaries, curiosity about the therapeutic implications of shared consciousness, uncertainty about whether I was treating Emma or being treated by her. These were indeed my conscious thoughts during the session, but Emma experienced them as dream content that she could access through her artistic process. The boundary between dreaming and waking isn't as clear as most people think, Emma explained while adding details to my sleeping portrait. When you focus intensely on understanding someone else's inner experience, you enter a kind of dream state where your consciousness overlaps with theirs. Over several weeks, our art therapy sessions became collaborative dream explorations. Emma would sketch both of us in various states of sleep and waking, documenting the shared psychological spaces we created through therapeutic focus. Her sketchbook filled with recursive imagery, me drawing her while she drew me, both of us asleep and awake simultaneously, engaged in therapeutic conversations that occurred across multiple levels of consciousness. The breakthrough came when Emma created a drawing that showed both of us awake, sitting at the art therapy table, but surrounded by countless sleeping versions of ourselves. Each sleeping figure was engaged in dreaming about the others, creating a complex network of shared unconscious experiences. This is what really happens during therapy, Emma explained. The conscious conversation is just the surface. Underneath, all the sleeping parts of ourselves are communicating, sharing dreams, helping each other understand things that can't be processed while awake. I realized she was describing the deeper psychological processes that make therapeutic relationships effective, the unconscious connections between therapist and patient that allow healing to occur through mechanisms that transcend conscious intervention. Emma, what happens if we both fall asleep during a session? Then someone else draws us, she replied, pointing to a figure in the background of her sketch that I recognized as Dr. Williams. The network of shared dreams includes everyone who's focused on understanding consciousness through therapeutic relationships. Last week, I found Emma's sketchbook open to a page I hadn't seen before. It showed me sleeping at my desk late at night, surrounded by art therapy materials, dreaming about patients who could access shared unconscious experiences through creative expression. In the drawing, Emma sat beside me, also asleep, dreaming about therapists who discovered that healing occurs through collaborative unconscious processes that art can make visible. The sketch was signed by both of us, though I don't remember signing it. Below our signatures was a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. Some therapeutic relationships exist primarily in shared dream states, where healing occurs through collaborative unconscious exploration that transcends the boundaries between individual minds. The art therapy continues, but now I understand that Emma and I are both patients and therapists simultaneously, using artistic documentation to access psychological territories that exist beyond individual consciousness. The sketchbook preserves not just images, but the shared dream states where real therapeutic work occurs, where the boundaries between self and other dissolve into collaborative healing processes that can only be witnessed through the kind of focused creative attention that Emma taught me to access.